Buenos días con todos, esperando que todos se encuentren muy bien. Mi nombre es Alessandra González, soy asociada de investigación de la División de Competitividad, Tecnología e Innovación del BID. Nosotros, en conjunto con el Departamento de Investigación, les damos la bienvenida a este evento de 2 días de innovación abierta y emprendimiento corporativo. En este evento hay traducción simultánea. Para seleccionar su idioma de preferencia, por favor dé clic a la imagen de mundo y escoja entre inglés y español. También la opción de chat está disponible para poder enviar sus preguntas. Good morning, everybody. In this today event, we have simultaneous translation available. To select your preferred language, please click the word image and choose between English and Spanish. Also, the chat is available to send your questions. Sin más, le cedo la palabra para hacer la bienvenida a Eric Parrado, economista jefe del BID, y Gonzalo Rivas, jefe de Competitividad, Tecnología e Innovación, para las palabras de apertura a este evento.
Muchas gracias, Alessandra, y muy buenos días a todas y todos. Mi nombre es Eric Parrado, soy el economista jefe y gerente general del Departamento de Investigación del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Y hoy me complace darles la bienvenida a este evento, Innovación Abierta y Emprendimiento Corporativo, Avances y Retos en 4 países de América Latina, el cual organizamos junto a la División de Competitividad, Tecnología e Innovación de nuestro banco. En los próximos 2 días, expertos académicos, representantes corporativos y formuladores de política de desarrollo productivo discutirán avances en investigación académica, teórica y aplicada en esta materia. Asimismo, compartirán su perspectiva y lecciones aprendidas en el desarrollo e implementación de iniciativas de innovación abierta y emprendimiento corporativo. Nuestro objetivo como banco de conocimiento y en particular como departamento de investigación es acercar la investigación de talla mundial como la de nuestro orador principal, el profesor Josh Lerner de Harvard, a la mesa de discusión donde toman asiento actores principales del ecosistema de emprendimiento e innovación abierta en la región. Pero tanto más importante es que estos actores retroalimenten nuestros procesos y aprender de sus experiencias para así dirigir nuestra investigación hacia los problemas más acuciantes que ellos enfrentan. América Latina y el Caribe se encuentra hoy día en una encrucijada. Como ya señalamos en el informe macroeconómico de hace algunos años, el bajo crecimiento de la productividad por trabajador en la última década se ha traducido en niveles de crecimiento insuficientes para atender las crecientes necesidades y demandas de la población. La región tiene que fortalecer y dinamizar con urgencia sus ecosistemas de investigación, desarrollo, transferencia e implementación de innovaciones para acelerar el crecimiento de la productividad. La pandemia global del COVID-19 ha resaltado las brechas en adopción tecnológica de la región frente a los países desarrollados. La innovación abierta ha permitido generar resultados concretos y relevantes para la sociedad, a la vez que ha repartido el esfuerzo y los beneficios derivados de dichos avances tecnológicos entre los diferentes agentes que en ella participan. Es entonces importante robustecer las iniciativas de innovación abierta, atrayendo nuevos participantes que aporten dinamismo a la generación, transmisión y uso del conocimiento. Pero no quiero irme sin destacar un tema de particular relevancia. América Latina y el Caribe es una de las regiones más desiguales del mundo y uno de sus mayores problemas es la desigualdad de género. Las mujeres en América Latina tienen menos probabilidades que los hombres de trabajar, de ganar un salario igual por el mismo trabajo y de ser financieramente independientes. La pandemia del COVID-19 ha expuesto estas brechas y las ha ampliado. Promover la innovación y el emprendimiento en ecosistemas abiertos puede generar una mayor competencia en la economía, haciendo más costosa la discriminación de género, que como hemos demostrado tiende a basarse en gustos. Adicionalmente, impulsar el paradigma de innovación abierta de manera inclusiva permite agregar el conocimiento de las mujeres y otros grupos marginados al aparato productivo de una manera mucho más eficiente, dado el dinamismo de los mercados frente a la evolución de la cultura corporativa. Ambos mecanismos pueden ayudar a cerrar esta brecha de género y de desigualdad. Con esto concluyo. Antes de pasarle la palabra a Gonzalo Rivas, quería darle las gracias a él y a todo su equipo por la excelente colaboración en la organización de esta conferencia. Además, quería expresar mi agradecimiento especial a todos los presentadores que participarán a lo largo de los próximos 2 días. De verdad que es un lujo tenerlos a todos y sé que todos aprovecharemos muchísimo los conocimientos que nos aportan, así que los dejo en muy buenas manos. Gonzalo.
Gracias, Eric. Muy buenos días a todos. Es un placer realmente estar participando en esto. Tal como mencionó Eric, es una actividad conjunta entre el Departamento de Investigación del banco y nuestra División de Competitividad, Tecnología e Innovación. La innovación abierta es un fenómeno que está presente hace muchos años en el mundo, pero que en el último periodo ha tenido una alza significativa. Uno lo aprecia desde el punto de vista de cómo las grandes corporaciones, por ejemplo, están reaccionando frente al fenómeno de la digitalización creciente de la economía, frente a los desafíos en materia de hacer sus procesos más verdes y sustentables. Y entonces el conocimiento interno ya no basta y se dan cuenta de que allá afuera, fuera de las fronteras de su empresa, existe una cantidad cada vez más creciente de startups, de emprendedores, de innovadores, que están generando respuestas novedosas. Y por lo tanto, para mantenerse a un ritmo de innovación y de incorporación de esa capacidad de generación de valor que esté acorde con el ritmo de innovación que tiene el mundo, tienen que abrir sus puertas. Y entonces se produce un fenómeno de confluencia entre las necesidades de estas corporaciones, que vienen, por lo tanto, desde el lado de la demanda, con las posibles ofertas de soluciones que vienen de este mundo que está fuera de las fronteras de la empresa. Y en consecuencia, las empresas han generado diversos tipos de estrategias para poder atraer ese talento y ese conocimiento, esa innovación, hacia las puertas de adentro de su propia empresa. Hay algunas que participan en incubadoras o que tienen sus propias incubadoras. Otras empresas o corporaciones participan en fondos de capital de riesgo. Otras hacen desafíos y challenges y se vinculan con distintas universidades o centros de conocimiento, por ejemplo. Y este fenómeno, que lo hemos visto muy fuertemente en el mundo, también está hoy día presente y creciendo en América Latina, aunque como vamos a ver mañana, con características particulares. Alessandra y Edwin han estado entrevistando un número muy importante de corporaciones e industrias en América Latina, en estos 4 países que se menciona en la invitación, y las conclusiones son muy interesantes y yo no voy a hacer un spoiler, así que los dejo invitados para que mañana puedan verlas. Pero claramente hay una diversidad de situaciones y muchas de esas situaciones tienen que ver también con cuáles son las condiciones del ecosistema de emprendimiento e innovación que tiene cada uno de esos países. Ahora bien, esto también importa desafíos. Hay distintos retos que tienen posibles consecuencias desde el punto de vista de política pública. Desde luego, estos espacios de colaboración entre grandes corporaciones, startups, innovadores, emprendedores, pueden estar sujetos a relaciones asimétricas y se pueden expresar, por ejemplo, en temas de manejo de propiedad intelectual. Este tipo de vínculos no necesariamente son automáticos y fáciles de organizar. En muchas economías existen espacios de intermediación que permiten canalizar las posibles ofertas de soluciones hacia las demandas y desafíos que plantean las corporaciones. Y también existe un riesgo, y es el riesgo de que todo este esquema, en algunos casos, pueda ser utilizado por las propias corporaciones para anticipar y alertarse de posibles amenazas desde el punto de vista de su posición en el mercado, y así identificar competencia eventual, absorberla, neutralizarla, y por lo tanto consolidar posiciones de dominación en el mercado. Entonces hay un conjunto de desafíos, retos, tanto desde el punto de vista del conocimiento, de saber bien cómo funciona esto, para identificar cuáles son los eventuales problemas que podrían requerir intervenciones de política pública. Y ese es el objetivo de este evento, y nosotros estamos convencidos de que estos 2 días van a producir mucho valor. Y así que reitero el agradecimiento también, tal como lo dijo Eric, a todos los panelistas y particularmente a quienes han estado detrás de la organización del evento. Le paso la palabra entonces a Alessandra para que demos comienzo a esta conferencia.
Muchas gracias, Gonzalo. Muchas gracias a Eric también. A continuación, es un honor para nosotros presentarles a nuestro orador principal, Josh Lerner. Josh Lerner es profesor Jacob H. Schiff de Banca de Inversión en la Escuela de Negocios de Harvard y es codirector del Programa de Productividad, Innovación y Emprendimiento del National Bureau of Economic Research. Tiene un doctorado en Economía en la Universidad de Harvard y su investigación es pionera y se centra en capital de riesgo y organizaciones privadas de capital. También estudia las políticas de innovación y cómo impactan las estrategias de las firmas. Adelante, profesor Lerner.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here, and very much looking forward to the discussion that we will have with Juanita and I will have afterwards, and all your great questions. I will aim to speak for a little under 40 minutes, and then, as I said, we'll have some question and answer later on. Last thing I should probably say by way of preface is that this talk is based on an article which we can post if you wish, that my former colleague Raman Ananda, who has since defected from Harvard and gone to Imperial College in London, and I wrote early last year for the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and I'd be delighted to, as I mentioned, share that for anyone who would be interested. So the question, of course, being how to help venture capital, and clearly we're in a time of a lot of instability. We'll sort of start by pointing out that venture has cycles in general, and then think about what it means for innovation, as well as some of the more enduring structural challenges that are here. Clearly, this will rely on both, the more academic side of work, as well as, more applied work done over the years. One thing we know about venture capital is that it certainly is cyclical, right? That it seems to have a boom bust pattern, and as the macroeconomy shifts, venture mirrors some of those changes in dramatic forms, right? And when we look at the history of venture capital, we certainly see that when we look either at the number of funds raised or the amount of fund raised, we've had this sort of boom bust kind of cycles in terms of ebbs and flows around years like the dot-com boom of 1999-2000, the run up to the global financial crisis, and then in recent years. That chart, which I just showed, only really went back to the early 1980s, but if we look back even earlier, where the data gets a little sketchier, we would see that there was, cycles even in terms of booms in the 60s and even in the 50s, where one saw this rush of money in, higher valuations, and then a sort of process of disillusionment setting in. So here's the old professor: those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, yet those of us who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it. It's interesting that this is not, this process of boom and bust is somewhat counter where you should go if you were interested in the best returns. And perhaps perhaps surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, some of the years where venture capital investments have had the best performance are the years right after the crises, after the fundraising plunge. That would be years like 1991 to 93, or 2002, or 2009. And meanwhile, some of the worst performing funds have been in years just before crises, like 1999. That, in a way, one of the things that has made this challenging asset class for many investors is that, it seems that people rush in at exactly the wrong times and then are scared to invest in the worst times, right? So if you look at a correlation, here we're just using the US data, but it would look quite similar if we did this in many other countries. We've done this for China, Brazil, UK, many other places. You see a very similar pattern. The years in which lots of money is raised generally tend to be the years where returns are most disappointing, and vice versa. That this is a sort of a business where, for whatever reason, most people seem to get it. Most people seem to get it. Another way to look at this is to look at the returns by, around the time of recessions, right? And one sees in the years immediately prior to recessions, and you just focus in on the venture line here, which is the yellow line, you see that the years below recessions had quite low, this is the multiple of invested capital. So how much money did you get back, 8 to 10 years later? The years before the recession had multiples of 1.5, which means to say for every dollar you invested, you tied it up for a decade and you ended up with $1.50, not a great return. While the years immediately after, funds formed immediately after recessions end up having multiples of 2.5 or 3, much better kinds of performance. So the first point is that this is a cyclical business. A lot of these cycles seem to move with the public markets, though there are also dynamics which are quite specific to the private equity and venture industry in terms of, too much money chasing too few deals, and the kind of hyper competition that can come in. And, what we generally see is that the times when people run away are exactly the times when you want to be. Next, we'll turn to the topic of venture capital and innovation. And in some respects, it is clear that venture has been a huge source of innovation. It's seen most dramatically in the US economy because it's just simply been, that's the oldest venture industry by most measures and the best established one. And one way to look at this is to look at all the companies in the US, excluding banks and other finance houses, that went public between 1995 and 2019, and look at the economic activity that they represent relative of the subset that were venture backed and the ones that were not venture backed. When we look at the companies, for instance, that were still survived as of the end of 2019, more than half of the new companies, the companies that went public in this 25-year period, were venture backed. They represented 72% of the market capitalization. And if you look at the total R&D spending by these young companies, these companies which have been publicly traded for 25 years or less, they represented almost 90% of the market cap of the R&D expenditures. So these venture-backed companies, even though the number of companies attracting venture capital in any given year is very small, right? That over that 25-year period, it was typically only a couple thousand companies getting venture funding for the first time, as opposed to roughly 1 million businesses being started in the US each year. But those companies ended up being tremendously impactful and clearly had a huge impact on the innovative landscape in the United States. And we can see that globally as well, right? So here's one compilation. Numbers have sort of moved around a little bit since I did this, but where you look at the 10 most valuable companies in the world by market capitalization. And what one sees is that 7 out of the 10 of these companies, 5 US companies and 2 Chinese companies, were backed by venture capitalists. It's essentially a tremendous, so this is not just little boutique companies. Even when we look at, the largest companies in the world, we see this huge impact in terms of venture activity. The other side of this, of course, going back to some of the issues we talked about in the introduction, is that this innovation has real impact in terms of the economy as a whole. That this is not just simply a matter of, the 1/100th of 1% getting richer. Of course, many of the investors in the venture funds are pension funds and other public institutions. So clearly they benefit from this. But even more importantly is the economic activity that the companies funded by the venture capitalists generate. And in particular, what one tends to see is that we certainly experience in the US and more generally across the OECD is that almost all the job growth that is taking place in the US economy is being driven by very young companies. For instance, the most recent analysis by Pete Klenow suggests that companies under 5 years old essentially account for almost half the job growth in terms of employment. And essentially their estimate is that they're 3 times more productive in terms of creating jobs than more established companies. Now, one worry we might have, given what we talked about in the first part, is whether the kind of boom and bust process that we see in the venture industry, the kind of ebbs and flows, end up making a big difference in terms of the venture, the impact on innovation. And in particular, a lot of venture people like to style themselves as not really being affected by downturns, saying we raise money for a 10-year period. We've got this extended hold periods. Economy goes up, economy goes down. We're not really going to be affected about it. Here's a piece by Paul Graham and Y Combinator, right, making the argument that it's actually better in bad economies to be doing startups than in good periods. We tried to look at this a little bit more systematically and looking at innovation over cycles using patent data. So we went all the way back to the 1970s and looked at all the patents filed in general and compared them to the subset of patents filed by venture capital backed firms. And when we looked at and we tried to ask the question, what do we see in terms of venture activity? In general, what we saw is a pattern where there was indeed a negative impact in terms of these kinds of recessions on venture activity, despite the claims to the contrary, that early stage investment falls, the amount being invested in early stage deals falls, and certainly the amount of patenting by early stage companies falls as well. Later stage, it has much less of a consequence, but certainly there does seem to be some sensitivity in terms of this. In general, venture capitalists are really innovative. The companies backed by venture capitalists are really innovative. And in point of fact, the analysis that we did suggested that, for instance, a patent issued to a company affiliated with the venture capitalist is almost 5 times more likely to be a really high impact patent, to have a lot of citations than one filed by a corporation. Similarly, it's much more likely to be associated with path-breaking science and to be particularly broad and cross-cutting. But what we see is that during recessions, again, not only does the amount of patenting fall, but it also seems that the relative quality advantage of the venture-backed patenting seems to decline as well. That essentially of the patents that are issued to the venture-backed firms, which shrink as more than other patents that are just assigned to corporations in general, what one sees is they're less likely to be highly influential as well. So it does seem that venture capital isn't really isolated from the business cycles as much as we might like it to might like to think that it is, and certainly relative to the way that venture capitalists claim it is. This is a little hard to see, but if you look graphically, you can see that the dotted lines, which represent the depths of recessions, are indeed associated with lower patenting relative to other periods. You know, we could argue a lot of reasons that there might be a lot of reasons why this is. You know, it might be because there are fewer opportunities. We argue that that doesn't seem to be the case. Maybe it's harder to figure out which is good or which is bad, just simply because it's harder for startups to get traction. Are there fewer entrepreneurs seeking to get financing? That doesn't seem to be the case. A lot of it seems to come down to fears about raising follow-on financing, that people aren't willing to do early stage investing, not because they don't have money, but because they're worried that the companies won't be able to go and raise the B, C, D, the follow-on financing rounds, and that will make it more challenging. So another side of this, which is, I think, another side of the same coin, is that there is a sort of a bit of a flight to safety during downturns. And in particular, what we've generally seen during very good periods is that venture capitalists become more adventurous. So for instance, in geographies, they're more willing to go into emerging economies. They're more willing to, investors are more willing to back young venture firms that are just a first-time fund and so forth. During recessions and downturns, there seems to be a sense of saying we're much better off just giving our money to the traditional groups, the groups based often in the places where they've been active for quite a while, like Silicon Valley or China, and turning their backs to a certain extent on emerging economies, and also going for brand name groups that are really well established. And for instance, if you look at the period after the crash in 2000 and look at the fundraising in Australia or Europe or Latin America, you see that pattern very clearly, where you had a drop in fundraising that was much more dramatic than that in the United States, simply reflecting the fact that there was this sort of flight to safety. One other issue or concern that I'll talk about before we move on to government policy has to do with the problem that sometimes we call technology breadth. And in particular, when we look at where venture capitalists are devoting their funding and compare it to where they devoted it 15, 25, 35 years ago, one sees that there has been a narrowing in terms of where the money has gone. That they have shifted increasingly to doing investing in software-related businesses and moved away from hardware, from advanced materials, and many other sectors which are more related to the real economy. Sometimes these are called tough tech or deep tech, that these have become much more, much less common to being financed by venture groups. And for instance, we're doing a project with one government which is very concerned that they've done a lot of innovation in, for instance, area like quantum computing, and that their researchers are not turning it into businesses. And one of the things that's very striking is just how many of these quantum computing firms, for instance, have found it to raise venture capital. In as much as they're raising money, seems to be more from governments, from university-based research things, sometimes from corporations, but challenging to raise money from the traditional venture sector. This in some sense is not crazy. If you look at the data, for instance, that is compiled by one of the leading consulting companies on venture returns, Sandhill Econometrics, which tries to look at returns by individual investment. The conclusion is that the returns from doing software and internet investments have been vastly higher than those from doing investments in areas like advanced materials or many other computer hardware and so forth. And given that the venture capitalists are very rational in terms of focusing on the areas where the private returns are the largest. But if we think that there are, in some cases, social returns, which might be much larger from an area, for instance, like clean tech, that might be a real source of concern. Another aspect of downturns, which we certainly saw in the first couple quarters of 2020, was in terms of the flight to safety and the impact it has on the diversity of the venture industry, which is a topic that's come up already in the introduction. That certainly during this period, as part of the flight to safety, for instance, funds that were being organized by first-time founders, and particularly, many of the funds, for instance, raised by women, which we depict here, which were, in many cases, disproportionately first-time funds because of just simply the difficulties they've had in terms of raising funds in the industry historically, really struggled relative to their the established groups in terms of being able to raise capital. So again, venture is very, very, a very key source of financing for innovation. It does seem to be cyclical, and it does seem to be somewhat narrow, and as such, a little bit hard to embrace it as a pure cure. In the last 10 minutes or so, let me spend a few minutes talking about some of the public policy issues, given that we've got a number of policy experts on the call here. And certainly one question you can begin is saying, why should the public sector care about this thing, right? And I think here again we'd say venture capital is relatively small. It's young. It's small even in the U.S. relative to other financial markets, and clearly in most other countries it's far smaller. But again, we'd say these are the kind of companies they're funding are going to find it very difficult to raise financing elsewhere. The ventures create a lot of wealth and jobs, as we talked about before. And in addition to the private returns, there's a sense of that there's a lot of social benefits from having venture activity, which can certainly extend well beyond the individual investment. So it's a situation which calls out for potentially public sector intervention. Moreover, when we look at the history of venture capital clusters, not just simply Silicon Valley in the United States, but we can look at Israel, Singapore, and lots of other places. In almost all cases, there is the fingerprints of government intervention early on. That it seems that creating a venture sector from scratch by the private sector is very challenging, and that in many cases, the government has played a catalytic role. Now, at the same time, it's fair to say, and this is a point that never is a very popular one, but that for every program that's been the government program to promote venture capital that has been successful, we can probably point to 2 or 3 that just ended up spending a lot of money without having very much to show for it. In a lot of cases, this is very understandable that this is a complicated process. It's not intuitive how to do this. It's very different from many other forms of economic policy that governments deal with. And as a result, mistakes are made. Well-intentioned, but mistakes. The other side, of course, is that there are examples where, these programs have ended up being captured by people who have ended up directing the funds themselves. This is something that we've seen in the United States and many other countries around the world. So in a lot of ways, one of the points that I've always emphasized is that in as much as one can keep distance between the government and the entrepreneurs, one is better off. I think we recognize, this is a study that one of our recently deceased colleagues at Harvard, Alberto Alcina, did with Larry Summers, where they looked at central banks and made the point that the more independent the central bank, the more effective it was in terms of controlling inflation. In the same way, we might say that in terms of these kinds of venture programs, the more in which public programs can be given some degree of independence from the changing political dictates of the government, it's probably better off as well. And again, not only is that something that we can show empirically, but also, when we look, for instance, at the case study evidence, efforts like the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund, which has been quite successful, the kind of independence that was built into it, I think was very important in terms of the kind of success, resisting the temptation to do the quick hits or the investments that would have, very substantial, early returns rather than thinking about longer run goals. One way to also address some of this is in terms of relying on matching funds. So in other words, rather than saying we as a government are going to figure out what sectors are the best ones and sort of top down impose this, it often seems to be far more effective to essentially require that people go and get funding from the private sector and then providing a match there. Again, probably the classic example here being the YOSMA program in Israel, which really set the template for building venture industries. And essentially, again, where it was very consciously designed to leverage foreign expertise, that in some sense, the earlier experience where the Israeli government had tried to directly fund entrepreneurs without a lot of guidance had been a miserable failure. So the idea here was very much to try to leverage the expertise, and it proved to be extremely successful. All right, we've seen some examples recently of interventions, and a lot of ones in last year as the COVID crisis hit. But I think it's still worth underscoring that this is not an easy area, right? That when we look at the venture arena, most investments are going to be failures. There's only going to be a relatively small number of successes. And this can be quite challenging for an environment for policymakers to intervene in. In some sense, when one's in a business of supporting Main Street businesses, like for instance, the payroll protection plan in the United States, one can imagine that just sort of sprinkling money to everyone, it may work pretty well. But in a venture world where you've got this extremely skewed world where most companies are going to be total disappointments and there's only a small number of winners, it can make it much more challenging in terms of figuring out how, as a government official, to allocate these funds. And moreover, one can see, even people who have thought and tried hard can run into situations where there are unintended consequences in terms of what's taking place. So one example in the United States was after the global financial crisis, the Obama administration set up a program to give billion-dollar grants to clean tech startups. They didn't design it terribly well in terms of having very subjective criterion. The government made all the decisions themselves. And in many respects, I think people have argued that it was counterproductive because they essentially gave money to the, in some senses, wrong companies, the ones who just lobbied the most intensely. And in many cases, the venture capitalists looking at these huge funds going to certain companies were reluctant to fund other companies. So it ended up, again, with the best of intentions, being quite counterproductive. Very briefly, we've done some work, and I can post this online as well if people are interested, looking at government programs around the world over the last 25 years. We basically gathered a lot of information from OECD, EU, and many other sources. We were able to find around 750 policies initiated during this pattern. Essentially just looking at the distribution of policies, you see that they're scattered pretty much around the globe within Latin America, with the Chileans unsurprisingly being the most adventurous in terms of the number of policies, in terms of the dollar budgets, again, Chile being quite high, as well as Brazil. In general, in terms of budgets, not surprisingly, the biggest countries ended up being the places with the most activity. If you normalize budget by GDP, it's a slightly different picture, and we see, for instance, Canada, Finland, and so forth, Turkey being among the most aggressive places. Just to highlight some of the things that we found that by and large, these programs work the best, consistent with what I mentioned before, in places where there's already a private venture industry and where the programs work with the private venture industries. For instance, by doing matching fund requirements, involving the private sector in the decision-making process and so forth. Moreover, quality of government matters. So if we use some of the World Bank scores measuring, how good the governments are, it seems that they're ones which are more likely to use some of these things, and it seems that these are, associated with greater innovation coming out. So in some sense, again, the analysis we do reinforces the conclusion that, public programs can be very positive, but one has to really see them not as a substitute for private venture capital, but more as a complement working alongside it. So I think that in some sense, we can say there's a pretty compelling case for government intervention, that venture sector can have a huge impact, but also has some very real limitations. And we can imagine this can be potentially very positive, but the devil is in the details, to use an American slogan, right? That how one designs it and puts it together has an enormous impact in terms of how successful the programs are. And in particular, the importance of having the programs run in an independent manner along the lines of a good central bank, as well as relying on matching funds from the private sector, is very important. We could talk a lot more about this stuff. This is a topic I'm very passionate about, but I think the time has passed for me to bring my presentation to a close, and I'll look forward to the questions that we will have once Juanita talks, and we can both answer some questions together. So thank you very much for the chance to talk here.
Muchas gracias a usted, profesor Lerner, por esta enriquecedora presentación. Ahora quisiera presentarles, por favor, a Juanita González Uribe, quien es profesora asistente en la London School of Economics and Political Science. Juanita tiene un doctorado en Finanzas y Economía de la Universidad de Columbia. Su investigación se centra en emprendimiento, capital privado e innovación para diferentes regiones, incluyendo la de América Latina. Se enfoca en empresas de capital de riesgo, aceleradoras de negocios y cómo la política pública puede ayudar a mitigar las fricciones en los mercados de emprendedores. Muchas gracias, Juanita. Adelante.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be amongst friends. It's also a very tough job to speak after Josh. So thank you to the organizers for that challenge. And the title of my presentation is Business Accelerators. And to be a bit more precise, what I want to talk about today is about what we have learned about business accelerators over the past, I would say, almost 10 years of research. What are the open questions that I think are interesting, that we should be focusing on? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the role of corporates as well. Just checking my chat. So let me start with a broad motivation. I'll give you more details of what I'm interested in here with Business Accelerators. So Business Accelerators are increasingly important institutions in entrepreneurship ecosystems. And from only a few in the early 2000s, there are now thousands worldwide. Now, accelerators, what they aim to do is to support young businesses by providing entrepreneurs with often non-monetary resources like business training or some mentoring, and sometimes cash, but not always. It's not deemed to be necessary for many of these programs. Now, this aim of supporting young businesses, I think, makes sense because we know that entrepreneurs often lack the key resources to transform promising ideas into successful firms. And moreover, many of these resources are often not easily acquired by entrepreneurs outside of accelerators for a number of reasons that I'll focus on later on. So in paper, Business Accelerators, I think they make sense. Now, despite their popularity and the fact that in paper they seem to make sense, the evidence on their success is actually still very thin. And rigorous introspection efforts by these programs, either whether investor-led or government-led, is actually quite uncommon. The vast majority of these programs, what they do to judge their success is that they focus on some very, very carefully selected case studies, which precisely because they're carefully selected may not be representative of what's happening on average. Now, that said, there's this growing evidence from more rigorous academic studies, and that evidence seems to be pointing towards the idea that accelerators are adding value to their participants. But several questions remain understudied. Included, we want to understand more, which of the services that business accelerators are providing matter for entrepreneurs and why, right? And what does the evidence that business accelerators can have an impact on entrepreneurs tell us more generally about the nature of constraints that entrepreneurs are facing? So is it that they lack capital, or is it as well that they lack certain skills or certain resources? And how do these things vary depending on whether you're in developed or underdeveloped economies, which we know are quite different? Now, also other questions, that remain is, how should we think about business accelerators that are sponsored by corporates? Are they different? Why are they special? And I want to focus a little bit of that at the end of the presentation. But let me now move on to some definition. Let's start with just by thinking, what are business accelerators? So accelerators are fixed-term, cohort-based programs that provide entrepreneurs, as I said, often with non-monetary resources and sometimes, but not always, cash. Now, when I talk about this non-monetary resources, what do I mean? They typically include a combination of standardized business training, and there's often an emphasis on pitch training. So teaching entrepreneurs how to present their ideas to potential investors, how to sell whatever it is that they're working on. Some of this business training sometimes also focuses on marketing, so similar to this pitch training, as well as human resource management. But in reality, this really does vary across programs. And the standardized business training covers lots of the topics that potentially some of these entrepreneurs may also be able to acquire in other types of institutions, for example, kind of like a business school. Now, other than this standardized business training, often held in groups, what else do business accelerators provide? They often also provide customized advice and guidance, and this is typically in the form of, access to mentors or industry experts that help these entrepreneurs figure out the day-to-day issues in their business, as well as think more strategically about how to transform their ideas into more marketable business models. Now, finally, the last bit, kind of like broad type of non-monetary resource that accelerators provide are exposure to and opportunities for networking with like-minded people, so other participants in their cohort, as well as, potential investors or business connections. Even the staff of the accelerator may know other people. And so just by participating in the accelerator, there's this notion that you're accessing or tapping into a network. Now, where do accelerators fit within the life cycle of a startup? And so Josh was talking about venture capital just now, which in my venture life cycle, which is, it's basically at the end. So really accelerators come before that. And so if you think broadly, this is not the true life cycle of every single startup, but on average, typically how does it work? So you have an entrepreneur that comes up with an idea, and the first line of support is typically their family and their friends. These are the guys that are going to be providing some initial financing. And then once they have some sort of as the beginning of a prototype, this is when they can start thinking about accelerator programs. And really, the way I see accelerator programs, of course, there's heterogeneity on this, but on average, I think they help entrepreneurs that already have some sort of prototype, transforming that into something that looks like a business model. And then once this has happened, then kind of like this average venture that I'm describing can then access more specialized financing. And we know angel investors are important. Financiers at this point, they've become increasingly important, increasingly more sophisticated. And then after that, they can access the big leagues, right? And then just go to venture capital. So what is kind of like the big distinguishing feature about accelerators, which I've been already talking about, is this notion that they're not only providing cash, right, as as your family and friends would do, but they're also providing this non-monetary support, right? And they often describe that non-monetary support as kind of like as education services, right? So they're educating entrepreneurs. And that's why many of these programs often have school-associated names, or they describe themselves as academies, and the participants of these programs also describe themselves as alumni. And this is quite particular to accelerators. So family and friends may occasionally provide some of this if part of your family or the friends of the entrepreneur have some experience. And angel investors and venture capital, they clearly add value. I mean, most of the returns are often predicated on that notion, specifically for venture capital. But what's different of accelerators is they have like structured programs where they're trying to impart to entrepreneurs either some know-how on how to run their business, as well as just a structured way of providing them with contacts. And so that's really what's new here about accelerators. Now, as I said, this has become increasingly important over time. This is data that I took from Crunchbase. And so what you have here is at the early 2000s, we had a couple or a few of these programs, but this has incremented quite tremendously over time. And this is a phenomena that is not only in the US, is not only in developed countries, it's really worldwide. They're quite present in fact, in many underdeveloped countries. They are often being used as governments, as a policy to promote entrepreneurship and to promote businesses. Now, there's many well-known names, Y Combinator perhaps being the most well-known of. And even though I've described accelerators as a kind of like as a homogeneous kind of like type of institution, in reality, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And an interesting type of heterogeneity that I would like to invite you to consider is a type of sponsor behind the accelerator. And so I think you can broadly classify those into three. And so the first are the accelerators that are sponsored by private investors. So the typical example here would be Y Combinator, and the investor would be Paul Graham, that Josh was also mentioning, a very well-known guy, an important guy in the entrepreneurial world. And so with accelerators that are investor-led, their goal is typically to make some profit, of course, helping out the participants in their cohort, but it's really profit-driven. And the types of entrepreneurs that they typically take in after very rigorous selection criteria, often as rigorous or even more than venture capital, is that they're going to be focusing on more later stage kind of entrepreneurs with more of a proven track record, definitely a working prototype. And the types of services that we're providing are these non-monetary services that I've been describing, but they often accompany this with cash. And then they're going to take from the startups an equity stake. And this is kind of like how the contract works between the startups and the accelerators. But those are not all the accelerators. In fact, there's other two types of accelerators, at least from the perspective of the sponsors. And the second type are the ones that are led by corporates. And these are the ones I'm going to focus on at the very last part of my presentation, but I want to introduce them now. And so how do you think of them? So here the sponsor is not really a private investor, so a group of individuals. Instead is a big corporate. And so examples of this would be, for example, WIDA, which has presence in a lot of parts of Latin America. It's sponsored by Telefonica. That's the corporate behind WIDA. And Microsoft Ventures was also an example of a business accelerator. Microsoft Ventures changed the accelerator for a fund recently, but it started out as an accelerator. Now, what's the goal for the corporate-led accelerators? It's slightly different. So many of these are typically non-profit, at least in the short term, to the extent that they're not requesting equity stakes from their participants, but rather they're just providing services, quote unquote, for free. Now, what is it that corporates may be taking out of this, and why does it make sense for them to think about having an accelerator and providing the services? It's a great way for technology discovery. It's also a great way to play a role of a matchmaker So typically corporates will have like a big set of clients, many of which have some needs that the the corporate itself is not working in, like, you know, some innovation issues that the corporate is not really working or is not planning to work in. But through the accelerator, they can learn about, you know, some new entrepreneurs and some new startups that are working in that area. And so what the corporate can really do is play this role of matchmaker, right? So the corporate is in a great position once it has a business accelerator to play the role of matching, you know, supply of demand in terms of new technologies and new needs that their own clients may have. And there's more, and we can talk about those as well in the discussion. Now, in terms of selection criteria, it's often going to be similar to the selection criteria of the investor-led accelerator. So these are going to be more later stage, you know, definitely with a working prototype. And as I said, so these guys typically provide non-monetary resources. That's a given, but they may or may not provide cash. So, for example, in the case of Microsoft Ventures, when it was live, this program, it provided no cash. Now, the last type of accelerator, you know, broadly speaking, in terms of sponsors, are those that are sponsored by either governments or universities or often mixed entities, and they're typically known as ecosystem accelerators. And their goal there is quite different. They typically do not necessarily care that much about their cohort of participants. I mean, of course they care and they provide them with, you know, many resources, but they all have often an ultimate goal beyond the participating cohort. And it's more about stimulating the startup ecosystem, really, you know, driving a cultural change in either the region or, you know, the specific country in which they're in. And a typical example of this would be Startup Chile, which is a very well-known business accelerator. It, as the name suggests, is from Chile, sponsored by the Chilean government. And its very beginning, it was seen as a tool to really change the mentality of the Chilean kind of like population, to really kind of like become more acceptant of entrepreneurship and think of it as a potential solution to really, you know, build like do groundbreaking work in the corporate sector and really be able to leave off of entrepreneurship, right? Like as a way to create jobs. Now, what's interesting in ecosystem accelerators is that typically the selection criteria can vary. So they will be able to accept, or they actually tend to accept participants that are more like early stage. They may not necessarily have a prototype. In some cases, they may not even have a specific company, and it may just be about a particular business idea. And these accelerators, they always provide non-monetary resources. Again, they have like this education idea behind what they're doing, and they may or may not provide cash. So as I said, this is something that is sometimes there, sometimes it's not there. And other examples other than Startup Chile, Village Capital is quite well known, and Valle is an accelerator I've worked with in Colombia, and I'll come back to this in a couple of slides. So, of course, at this point, the question is, you know, why business accelerators? I mean, of course, you know, you may believe that that these programs may not be needed, right? So, in some sense, if markets worked efficiently, then, you know, good ideas should always be able to attract funding, should always be able to attract labor and other inputs that are important, right? And so why would, in that kind of case, business accelerators be needed? So, I mean, that's a great question, but what we know is that in practice, entrepreneurs, even those that have genuinely good business ideas, may not be able to attract capital and may not be able to attract labor for different frictions that may exist in the economy. And I'll come back to those later on. And moreover, even when entrepreneurs have access to the right inputs, what they may lack is the know-how about how to combine those inputs into marketable outputs in kind of like in the most efficient manner. And so really what business accelerators are here to do is try to alleviate these types of issues. So let me give you kind of like a more concrete example. And so the typical example, and really in entrepreneurship, when we think about entrepreneurship policy, would be, for example, capital constraints, right? Is the idea that entrepreneurs with genuinely really good ideas may not be able to attract capital, and a typical explanation would be, you know, maybe we have information asymmetries in the market, right? So it's very difficult for investors to distinguish which are the good and which are the bad entrepreneurs, and fear of attracting the bad entrepreneurs basically led them not to invest at all, right? So the typical lemons problem. Now we know from Josh's talk that, you know, Vcs specialize in tackling precisely this friction. Right, so we know that they've developed institutions and a way of selecting entrepreneurs, all this due diligence that really goes after trying to to mitigate these information asymmetries that can exist. But even if these types of information asymmetries are not there, there may be more fundamental, more basic reasons why entrepreneurs may not be able to attract capital. So a different type of reason would be that entrepreneurs simply lack an understanding of the key information that specialized investors like VCs are looking for in making investments. And business accelerators aim to help precisely there. Now, why is it that entrepreneurs may lack this understanding, right? I mean, is it because they're bad and as a consequence, we should just like not be throwing money? Or is there like a genuine reason why this may happen? And I think there is. So kind of like a typical explanation here would be the idea that, you know, one of the reasons why entrepreneurs don't know what VCs are looking for when they're making investments is that VCs themselves have developed through this, you know, these tools that I was describing before to kind of like mitigate information asymmetries that exist in the economy, some private heuristics to make judgments about investments. And by heuristics, what I mean is kind of like mental shortcuts that allow people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. Now, of course, why is it that VCs use these heuristics? What's happening here? Well, they typically use that rather than more standard ways of evaluation, like, you know, thinking about cash flows, discounting these cash flows, and then trying to value those as we would do with a typical corporation that is mature and for which we have lots of information. And so VCs cannot do that because for startups, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to find this sort of very rich information for starters. And second, it's quite difficult to actually evaluate their potential, not only because there's information that's missing, but because we know that there's a lot of uncertainty associated with what could happen to the startups going forward, as well as there's a lot of skewness in their returns. So there's only a few that actually really make it well, and the vast majority are not doing well. And so VCs, given that problem, what they've developed is this heuristics. And the issue is that because these have been privately developed, they're not taught in any university curricula. They often require a good deal of guided experiential learning. So you kind of have to either work for a VC or have gone to a lot of, you know, pitch presentations, you know, where entrepreneurs are presenting their ideas to understand exactly what is it that VCs are looking for. And that is exactly the space where accelerators try to help in, right? What they want to do is provide entrepreneurs with such guided experiences that otherwise may be very difficult for entrepreneurs to get a hold on. And that's only one example, right? That would just be the idea of capital constraints. But there's more. So in essence, accelerators, as I was saying, you can think of them, and they certainly, many of them see themselves as kind of like a new type of school, but this is for entrepreneurs. So just as kind of like the managers go to business schools to really get their MBAs and be great at strategy and you know, turning around their businesses, then you can think of accelerators as being the place where entrepreneurs can go and learn about all the tools that are needed to start up a business, to really go from an idea to a business that you can sell. And they do that by providing the types of services that business schools provide as well, right? So you can impart know-how in a business school through, you know, through the classes, right? Through, of course, you can also impart know-how to the participants through interactions with their peers, right? Or the guest speakers or you know, the advisors, whoever is associated with the program. And this is going to be true as well in an accelerator, right? So that's why exactly they have this group training with some standardized classes with a lot of content. It exactly works as a business school, right? And they have guest speakers, industry experts, mentors that visit. Now you can imagine that a business school can also help the manager, you know, with some certification, right? If once the manager has the MBA, you know, you see that diploma everywhere because that's going to buy the manager a lot of things going forward. Something similar can happen with a business accelerator. Right now, we talk about the Alumni Y Combinator, who was sponsored by whom. So we understand this idea of certification. There's also the notion of self-validation. So just by participating in these programs, you may feel better, right? Let's forget about the market for 1 second. I have my MBA and that just makes me feel a better manager, more confident about my abilities. Something similar can be happening with entrepreneurs and accelerators. And there's finally the notion of structured accountability. So just the fact that in a business school, you have to, you know, set your learning goals, go to class, you know, come up with your homeworks and solutions for exams. This sets up like a mentality that's something you can go back to your, you know, your company and set something up. And this is something that as well could be happening in a business accelerator, right? This structured accountability can help organize, especially entrepreneurs that are inexperienced and don't know exactly how is it that you have to be accountable, self-accountable when you're running your business. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on a case study in Valle, which is the accelerator that I mentioned before, which is in Colombia. And I've explored and I've worked with Valle very closely with Santiago Reyes, who we'll be hearing from in a couple of minutes. And I want to tell you a little bit our experience with Valle and what we learned when we worked with them and trying to assess what was the impact that Valle was having in participants. So let me tell you a little bit of Valle. So Valle is a business accelerator in Cali, which is the third largest city in Colombia, and it's been around, I think, since 2015. And the main aim of Valle is really to unlock the gazelle potential or the high growth potential of the local entrepreneurs. So you could think of it as Valle as something of an ecosystem accelerator. So it's clearly thinking about the cohort of participants for sure, but it has an ultimate goal, which is really kind of like helping the local ecosystem kind of like really change and become much stronger. Now, specifically, the way that the program works, it's a fixed term cohort-based program. So it lasts for 3 months and it accepts 35 participants in each cohort. And it's targeting young businesses. So they had to be less than 3 years old, and it doesn't even have to be a business. It could be just a business idea. But what's important is for them to be have high growth potential. And so there's a selection criteria, there's a selection committee that takes a look at the applications, and there's some judgments made with respect to whether the specific participant has potential for high growth. Now then what the accelerator does during those 3 months is provide no cash to participants, so no money is given. But instead, what the program offers is 3 types of non-monetary services, which I also broadly described before. So there's the standardized group training, there's also customized advice in a couple of ways, and there's also the additional visibility in events and magazines. Valle is sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce in Colombia, which is an organization of business individuals, and they organize events and magazines, and the participants of Valle, are part of kind of like of this world once they become accepted into the program. So then Santiago and I, we partnered with Valle to take a look at least the first cohort and see what had been the impact of participation in the program. We develop a specific methodology because, as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to actually answer that. We know that Valle is selecting participants actively, so it's not like they randomly end up with some people in the program. So one has to be very careful when making statements about what's been the impact of the program, but we try to be in our paper. And what we find are, I think, 2 very important conclusions. So the first one is that we find very meaningful effects of participation in the accelerator in terms of performance. And the way we're measuring performance here is by looking at the annual revenue of the participants. And what we find is that participation in the accelerator increases annual revenue within 3 years of application by 163%, 66%. And this is relative to rejected applicants on average. And this is a causal effect, right? So we're being careful in trying to really distinguish the causal effect from the program from the fact that the program may be identifying which are the good applicants and selecting those. But then what's also very interesting is that we find that this effect is not homogeneous across the different types of applicants. There's in fact a lot of heterogeneity. In particular, what we find, and I think this is key for accelerated design, we find that the effect is being driven by the high potential participants. So what I have here in the x-axis is just, what's a treatment effect? What's the effect of going through the accelerator? And what I have in the x-axis is a proxy of the potential of the business at the moment of application. And what this plot is meant to show you is that this important impact that we see in annual revenues is really being driven by those startups that at the moment of application were the ones that had the highest potential. Those that didn't have that much potential are not being really kind of like enjoying any particular benefits from participating in the accelerator, at least in terms of the impact that it has on its revenues. Now we dig deeper to understand which of the services was really driving this effect. We run some interviews, so here we cannot be as rigorous, but we find some suggestive evidence that the impact appears to be driven by customized advice. So it's the idea that you get access to mentors and to industry experts that can give you advice on how to run your business day to day, but also in terms of strategy, that's really making the difference. And if you're interested and you want to know more about Valle, there's a video, a link to a video that I've posted in my slides, and I invite you to take a look. Okay, so that was the case of Valle. So now let me very, very quickly summarize what have we learned about accelerators And then I want to spend the last part of my presentation talking about corporate accelerators, how to think about them, what's special about them. So what have we learned about business accelerators? So I think there's roughly 4 main findings. So the first finding, very similar to what I just showed you with my paper with Santiago with Valle, is that there is now growing evidence that accelerators can have meaningful average effects on startup performance. So said differently, these programs tend to accelerate good performance. Interestingly, they also tend to accelerate death too. And we see this across very different regions. So I've listed here some articles that have looked at these effects. And so this is not only in US, this is not only in Colombia, it's happening in different parts of the world, right? In the paper by Roberts, they have all sorts of accelerators in different regions. The second result that I think is important is that this average effect is masking heterogeneity. So what does that mean? It means that not all participants are affected equally. So not everyone benefits. And importantly, not all accelerators create this impact, right? It's only some of them. So in my paper with Santiago for Valle, I already showed you some of this heterogeneity. We showed that the effect is driven by those that have a lot of potential at the beginning. And then we have some other papers that have looked at heterogeneity across accelerators. And there's this finding that shows that, not surprisingly, it's kind of like the top accelerators that are the ones that are driving this. So it's not about, the lesson is not, you take any company, no matter the quality, and you put it through any accelerator, there's going to be these great effects. That's clearly not what the evidence is suggesting, right? So it's not any company. It's one that really has potential, and then it's not every accelerator. Are those that are really, setting up their programs in an organized manner and really adding value to their participants. Now, moreover, there's also heterogeneity in terms of which of the services that are being offered, which are the ones that are really mattering. And I think the way to think about this literature is that it would seem that this kind of like group training, standardized training, where you sit entrepreneurs in kind of like in group classes, and you give them classes as you would in a business school, that doesn't seem to be really creating much value. At least not based on the evidence that exists so far. It could be about exactly how that curricula has been set. So it's very, I'm not going to say it will never create value, but at least with what we know so far, it doesn't seem that is the driver of the impact. It seems that it's more about the customized advice, the ability to have with a mentor, the ability to have this networking opportunities, the ability to have this structured accountability that you perhaps would not have otherwise. These are the kinds of services provided by business accelerators that seem to be having an impact. Now, finally, the last lesson, which I think is quite interesting, is that there's also this evidence that there's impact beyond participants, which I think kind of like justifies this idea of what I was talking about, this ecosystem accelerators that have this more like broad ultimate goals that are not only about helping their cohort, but thinking more about the region and really trying to change what's happening in a broader way. And so in particular, what we found is that accelerators seem to be imposing externalities on non-participants. And these externalities by far seem to be good. So here the key paper is by, but it's in the US by Yael and her co-author. And what they find is that the launch of an accelerator is associated with an increase in the number of VC deals and the total amount invested in the region. So this goes back to the talk by Josh, right? So it seems that having an accelerator is being able to, in some sense, accelerate venture capital activity within that region. And this is something that we replicated with some co-authors as well for the UK, and we find similar patterns. So here what you can see in the x-axis is just time relative to the formation of accelerator in a particular region within the UK. And of course, 0 is the moment at which the accelerator is formed. And in the y-axis, what you have is either the number of investments by VCs, and we're focusing here on early stage and high technology. And in panel B, what you can see is the value of those investments. And there's clearly this important increase that happens right after the accelerator has been created. So there seems to be some interesting externalities, or associations at least, between accelerators and VCs, which we already heard from Josh, at least VCs have a very important impact on entrepreneurs, but innovation and growth at large. Okay, so what are the open questions? So that's kind of like what we've seen. Where do I think we should ask more questions? So I think it's we should be thinking about, especially if these are programs that are sponsored by governments, we should be thinking about how to think about value added and cost and benefit analysis. So we've been focusing a lot on, are these programs doing anything? And I think it's probably high time to ask, well, if they're doing something, as it seems they do, how does that compare with the cost of running these programs? And in some sense, I think the good news here is that much of the evidence that we found of value added is coming from programs that are not providing any cash. So from the onstart, it seems that many of these programs may not be very expensive. And so it's possible that the cost benefit analysis may be overall at the end kind of like a positive balance. Now, I also think that rather than asking whether acceleration impacts startups, I think we're a little bit already, it's not completely established, but we have some evidence of that. I think given the evidence of heterogeneity, we should start discussing what types of services work best for which types of firms, right? There's clearly, it's going to be a mistake to treat every firm equally and to think about all accelerators and all services as equally. So we should embrace more that heterogeneity that has been shown so far. I think we should also be thinking about long-term impacts relative to the evidence that we have so far, which is mostly short-term. So we have to think a little bit more about long-term evidence. I think it's also important to think about effects on founders beyond the specific startups that participate. I mean, if we take for granted the idea that accelerators are really out there educating, then one would suspect that if a participant company, the accelerator accelerates death, just because this is not a good idea, it is possible that whatever the founder learned in the program is something that the founder can carry with her to different companies that this founder may either work in the future or set up on her own. And so I think that changing the focus from startup to founder is also something that we should start doing. I think also looking at effects on non-participants, what I was showing you at the end, I think it's also a very interesting area to explore a little deeper. But now let me move on to the last part of my presentation. I think the other thing we should be focusing on is understanding better the heterogeneity on the types of accelerators that exist, specifically based on sponsor. So the investor-led, corporate-led, and more of an ecosystem accelerator, and distinguish the expected effects from them. And what does the data tell us? And specifically think a little bit more about corporate accelerators, which I think the literature hasn't thought of enough. And so what's interesting about corporate accelerators? So as I said, most of the focus has been on ecosystem or investor-led accelerators. And by focus, I mean academic focus. But in practice, corporate accelerator programs have produced a global worldwide investment of over 206 million in over 11,000 startups. This is from a particular source, so there's some heterogeneity on exact numbers. But the point is that these programs have become increasingly important, have had an important monetary impact. And corporate accelerators, moreover, in paper, I think they can play a unique role in alleviating other types of constraints to growth relative to the ones that I was mentioning before. So before I was mentioning, okay, you have to attract capital, you may not be able to do this. You have to attract talent, you may not be able to do that. But there's other types of constraints that entrepreneurs may face. And so, for example, they may lack information about what clients need and what are their demand for certain types of services. And corporates are in a great place to know that. And the example that I was discussing before about the matchmaking role they can have. Entrepreneurs may also lack the know-how and experience that is required in certain industries, for example, with regulators. And again, corporates have all that experience. This is what they've been doing for a number of years, the typical corporate that we have in mind. And finally, they may have restricted access to some complementary intellectual property that the corporate has had developed over a number of years. And so you could imagine that there's unique angles that corporate accelerators can play in this particular environment that, say, an investor-led accelerator or an ecosystem accelerator could not play. Now, clearly there are some downsides and there's things to think about more deeply, right, about incentives. But of course, if you think about this from the perspective of an entrepreneur, what you would worry about would be, well, there's risk of an idea theft, right? So the corporate may be looking to use that idea for their own, or maybe risk of team poaching, maybe the risk of killer investments, right? So just investing in certain companies, not to really help them grow, but just to cut that competition going forward. So it's far from being an obvious thing. Now, I would end with this, just to think a little bit of what we know about the typology of corporate accelerators. And so I would say that there's roughly 3 of them. So one is kind of like the open innovation style, where startups are embed themselves at the corporate location, and they are provided with both financial resources and guidance. And the program is typically managed by the corporate employees, right? And you can think of it as an innovation source for the corporate. And there's some examples that I mentioned there. But that's not the only one that exists. You could also think about an external accelerator, where the corporate partners basically hire the third-party accelerator. That's the one that's going to provide the support to the startups. And so the program is really not going to be managed by the corporate employees, by this third party. An example of that would be how Microsoft Ventures was structured. And you could imagine that there, it may or may not, this complementarities in terms of innovation may or may not be there. Whereas in the open innovation mode, I think that was kind of like the rationale behind it. Finally, you could also think about innovation outposts, where what the corporate does is that they set up a dedicated office in some innovation hotspot that is typically managed by the employees, but what they're doing is market research. And this market research, of course, can include some interactions with local startups. And then what the corporate does is that it introduce some of that innovation into the company's headquarters. And examples of that exist. The SLES Outpost in Silicon Valley is just one of them. Okay, so let me conclude. I'm out of time. So Business Accelerators, I hope I've been able to convince you that they're an increasingly important institution in entrepreneurship ecosystems. And despite the popularity, we still know there's lots of open questions about them. Now, the evidence so far points to sizable value-added effects on participants, but we need to understand a little bit better, like what are the services that matter, why, and in terms of corporate accelerators, we want to understand a little bit more what makes them special relative to other accelerators out there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesora González Uribe, por su tiempo, por su presentación. A continuación voy a presentar a Santiago Reyes, quien es economista con 10 años de experiencia en la evaluación de impacto de programas de emprendimiento e innovación. Santiago tiene un máster en Public Policy en la Universidad de Chicago y actualmente es consultor del Banco Mundial en la unidad de firmas, emprendimiento e innovación. Adelante, Santiago.
Sandra, thank you very much, Professor Lerner and Professor Gonzalez. Well, I think it's very clear from your presentations about the importance of providing entrepreneurial financing and support to entrepreneurs and the impact that it has on growth and innovation. However, as Professor Lerner points out, government interventions might have several challenges, from how to select beneficiaries to probably affecting VC incentives. And of course, they need to be solved in order to have good public policies. And as Gonzalo started the presentation, talking about how large firms are entering this ecosystem, and now they're becoming key actors in terms of providing that support to entrepreneurs. And of course, governments are trying to find a way of how to mix the interest of large firms in providing services to entrepreneurs and how to promote innovation. So to start the discussion, I would like to ask you too about the role of large firms and corporations in investing and supporting entrepreneurs. So Professor Lerner, what differences should we expect from VC funds that are backed by large corporations relative to traditional VC funds, especially in terms of the cyclicity of their investments, the possible returns in terms of innovation, and of course in this context of COVID, where there are a lot of opportunities right now in the market, but also there's this need of large and medium firms to innovate. How do you see this playing out?
It's a great question and very interesting. You know, in some sense, we would hope that corporate venturing would avoid some of the limitations of independent funds, right? In the sense that corporations are, in many cases, doing venturing not solely or even primarily to generate financial returns, but rather to benefit strategically from the knowledge and feed that back into their organization. The challenge is that empirically, when you look at the experience of corporate venturing, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And in many cases, what we see is that corporations, rather than being long-term in terms of their outlook, tend to have a stop-start program, stop-start pattern that's even more dramatic than the institutional investors in venture funds. That corporations in many cases seem to be prone to fads. And when there's a lot of interest in terms of in venture capital in general, corporations will jump in. And then when the interest disappears, they will forget about it and rewrite it, right? And we have many examples, including one of a company that Juanita mentioned, right, who have done started programs, got rid of programs, started them, reconstructed them, abandoned them, and so forth, in a way that ends up being quite counterproductive in terms of the strategic goals. Now, not everyone, and there's certainly examples of some companies who have had programs that have lasted for decades and longer, but it has been somewhat disappointing at how inconsistent many corporations have been in terms of being prone to some of the same problems with faddishness.
Thank you very much, Professor Lerner. And Professor Gonzalez, can you tell us a little bit more about the incentives that these large corporations have to implement these support programs? As you mentioned in your presentation, you have some companies that are doing it and see it as a business growth strategy. Some others see it as a non-profit activity. But you also show a lot of heterogeneity in the impacts that these business accelerators can have. So how does the incentives behind these programs that large corporations are implementing can affect the results that they're observing on entrepreneurs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it connects very much with what Josh was saying with respect to the experience of corporate venture capital, right? Because you can think of corporate accelerators as just like a new type of corporate venture capital. So I think there's 4 potential advantages for a corporate to have an accelerator. And I'll discuss how to think about incentives once I've listed those. So broadly speaking, I think an accelerator can help the corporate by providing a tool for technology discovery, right? And this could be particularly important for the more larger, mature corporates that are not necessarily in touch with what the younger generations of inventors or entrepreneurs that are outside of that system, what they're doing, right? So it's a good tool for technology discovery. And the accelerator could also be a tool for finding talent, right? So it could be that you may not necessarily be after the specific innovation that the startup is working on, but you are able to identify good people to potentially hire. So not only invest, but potentially hire within your corporation. Third, I think it's a good way to connect with the startup community. And by doing so, it could also help change the culture within the corporate with respect to, for example, innovation incentives for their own employees. And finally, I mean, if we think about about these programs also, like from a nonprofit perspective, it could also be part of the corporate social responsibility strategy of the corporate. So if the corporate wants to take a little bit of advantage of their own core strength and use that for the corporate social responsibility angle, they could set up an accelerator where they're trying to teach to the world or share with the world what they've learned through their corporate process. Now, naturally, corporates are not in a vacuum, and to successfully benefit from setting up an accelerator, it is important to take into account and acknowledge the incentives of other agents in the economy, and this would include the entrepreneurs that would be the so-called participants of those programs, as well as the government institutions that may also be important actors in the entrepreneurial market. So, for example, imagine that the corporate is planning to use the accelerator to recruit talent, and this is well known. Well, this can be great for the accelerator. It could heavily impact the types of entrepreneurs that would apply, right? So the types of entrepreneurs that the corporate would end up attracting are those that either have the lowest potential, and this is why they want to join the accelerator, because they know that, you know, potentially the accelerator will absorb them and they can become their, you know, their employees, or those that for some reason want to hedge, right? They're worried a little bit about the risk, and, you know, if the corporate is clearly using this to hire, well, I might as well just participate in the program. So then the corporate has to worry about adverse selection, right? What are the types of entrepreneurs that will end up participating in the program? And that's not all, right? So it's not only about the recruiting of talent, right? The entrepreneurs may also worry about the, you know, their intellectual property. So you can discuss the corporate accelerator both as a great idea and kind of like a bright impact on innovation, because there's going to be this knowledge sharing between the corporate and the entrepreneurs that are going to participate. You can also have a more cynical view and think of that and say, well, the entrepreneur is going to be clearly worried that what the corporate would want to do is kind of like take the idea, and as a consequence, again, the types of entrepreneurs that will end up applying to the corporate are those that don't have such great ideas to begin with, or ideas that cannot be easily stealed. So then we worry about the selection. So I think it's important to think about these things carefully. I don't think the answers are super clear and they're not immediate. And I think they could potentially help explain why, up until recently, I would say that the experience of corporate venturing was not so successful. So I think they started out with independent venture capital firms, but their experience was not as successful. Recently, they've become increasingly more important. So we'll see whether they found answers to that incentives question.
Thank you very much, Juanita. And I think that answer is something that it's in the back of the head of many of our attendees that come from government agencies that are currently trying to design programs that allow large corporations to work hand in hand with entrepreneurs. So I think this will be a great opportunity for you and for Professor Lerner. What these policymakers need to think when trying to design open innovation programs? What lessons learned from the VC world can they take in order to avoid the unintended consequences that Professor Lerner, for example, shows in his presentation?
Juanita, do you want to take the first stab at that, or should I?
I'll give you the the head start. Go for it.
Well, I mean, I think that certainly, you know, one point that I think that probably we would all agree on is that this sort of trying to avoid, you know, sort of a top-down approach of trying to say, we think this is the right sector to go for, and we're going to provide all our incentives here, even if it potentially doesn't make sense. So, you know, we've seen, for instance, you know, in the United States, Marianne Feldman has a paper where she highlights that 49 of the 50 states have programs to promote biotechnology, which are predicated on the assumption that their state has some unique comparative advantage, which makes it very well suited for biotechnology. And whatever, no doubt some states do, but it's unlikely that 49 out of 50 have this comparative advantage. And we see the same thing playing out around the world, where in many cases, policymakers will jump on a popular topic and put a lot of resources there, even if in some cases it doesn't necessarily make the most sense, or the companies are likely to be the most sustainable. For instance, you know, we did some looking at one of the Australian states, and they had put, you know, enormous amounts of money into the universities for biotech. You know, essentially all the biotech companies that spun out, the good ones moved to Sydney because that's where the hub of the Australian biotech industry was, and the great ones ended up moving to San Francisco or San Diego. And when you really looked at the bottom line, there was sort of no real advantage to sticking around in the state because it just wasn't really a hub. There was nothing that really had any kind of stickiness to make the companies want to stay there. Meanwhile, when you look at the same place, they had a boom in startup companies focusing on mining companies or using drones for low water agriculture. And in some sense, it's hard not to think that they would have been much better served focusing on the areas where there was some real competitive advantage that made the companies want to stay there. And that, you know, in some sense, having that sort of market test of saying, we got to figure out who's using matching funds can go a long way to help, you know, help governments making good decisions about open innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that that I think that in the rush to do something, often governments, I would say, forget a little bit about thinking about the setup. So, I mean, I've worked a little bit with the UK experience recently, and UK is one of the governments that have spent an enormous amount of money trying to sponsor entrepreneurship for a long, long time. And many of the incentives that they have today have existed for a number of years. And it's only now that those incentives seem to be having some effects, but they certainly did not have any effects at the beginning. And so there was a bit of a discussion of what was that. And so some of the incentives that I'm mentioning here is one, the UK was one of the first governments to provide incentives for individual investors to invest in startups. So basically, they really wanted to incentivize angel investing. But this happened all the way back, you know, even before the 80s. And yet there wasn't much angel investing for a long, long time. And so why was that? And I think that part of what's going on is that, you know, you may have the great intentions, but if you don't have a population that understands exactly how angel investing works, and you don't have a mechanism for your population to actually find the startups that are looking for funds, then it's going to be very hard that setting up a tax incentive is really going to trigger the development of a market, right? And so I think that what's happened lately is that now the market has changed in such a way that these types of incentives can now be used much more. And I think an important catalyst here in the UK, at least, was, for example, the rise of crowdfunding, and in particular crowd equity platforms. And so now through those platforms, then individual investors can find those startups that before were very difficult to find, and now can make use of these incentives that have existed for a long, long time. So in some sense, I think that governments have to be, one, patient. So, you know, it may take some time for these types of policies to bear some fruit. And second, they have to think not only about providing that incentive and then walking away, but rather they have to think about the setup, just making sure that the conditions in the economy are enough so that the individuals and the startups and the community can be responsive to those incentives. And I think there's work to be done in both areas.
Thank you very much, Juanita and Professor Lerner. And one last question that I know that it has been in the back of our minds, and it's a really puzzling one, is that in developing countries, we don't have a huge pipeline of investable startups. Some of these business accelerators, some of the VC funds are trying to find like these startups, these innovative startups, but the cost of searching those startups are really high. And you see in developing countries that in this life cycle of financing of a startup, VC funds mix in the same level as some of these large corporations where they start financing earlier than what you see in more developed countries. So how do you see this on competition between VC funds and large corporations for this pipeline of innovative projects? And are there some complementarities where VC funds and large firms working together, trying to find these good projects can be useful for regions like Latin America?
I'll just take a very quick stab at answering you because I know time is short. I think that certainly there are complementarities between venture investing, corporate and independent venture firms, right? That, many businesses are very expensive to reach the point where they're, at a critical mass. In many cases, having the involvement of corporations as both customers and as investors can help bridge the gap to get to market. And this is particularly true for, some of these deep tech or tough tech companies. When it really works well, there is a sort of sense on each set of organizations as to where the limitations are and what, how they can be complementary. I think where it works less well is where you get, dueling agendas or lack of appreciation of what the other party can bring to the table. Great question.
Nita, do you have any?
No, I don't have much to add. I would say that it's important to, as Josh was saying, there's clearly two different types of investors. You can think of them as very different, right? So VCs are going to be more like financially minded, whereas the corporates are going to have potentially some strategic kind of like purpose as well. And it is possible that in some instances, these two things may clash. Right. So, for example, a VC, because it's more financially minded, may think about, killing one of investments because it's certainly not working. And so let's just get rid of this. Whereas the corporate may be a bit more patient, because there's the possibility that even though the way that the startup looks at this moment isn't working, by combining that technology with the technology of the corporate, in some notion, this could work going forward. And that may lead the corporate to not want to kill the investment and maybe wait a little bit more. And hence the fact that they have different objectives really will affect their decision-making process. And unless there's a very clear rule from the onstart, who's going to be leading the process when issues arise, then it could lead to a lot of conflicts. And so I think understanding from the beginning that the motivations can differ is going to be crucial, and then setting from the beginning a clear set of principles of who's going to determine who and how, whichever eventuality arises, or maybe setting up a contract in a way that provides control to the most important party, or the party that is less conflicted in that circumstance. I think it's very important. So it's not an easy answer, but I think acknowledging the difference from the beginning can be super important.
Great, thank you very much. And we have time for one last question that came through the chat, and is again in a setting where there's like scarce innovative entrepreneurs. Should governments focus on creating that pipeline and trying to focus on innovative sectors where there might be productivity gains, or should they focus on creating that pipeline where the market has some competitive advantages? How do you see the role of government creating that pipeline and maybe not taking an active role right now in VC investing, but more in creating the actual startups?
Well, certainly it seems that setting the table, as I call it, is really important, right? That unless you have an environment where it's conducive to entrepreneurship, it's extremely hard for money that goes into financing businesses to have much effect. One example that I often use is that of Japan, which spent an enormous amount of money in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, subsidizing venture firms and various kinds of financing programs, but ended up with very little to show for it because the tax code, the labor markets, and so forth made it so difficult for entrepreneurs to succeed. So in many senses, it's much less glamorous. In some sense, governments love handing out big checks to people. That's true for governments all around the world. But in a way, this process of creating an environment which is conducive for entrepreneurship is really a necessary first condition.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add the experience I had with Startup Chile. So Startup Chile, as I was saying in my presentation, is one of the most important business accelerators, and clearly in the region is the most important. And this is a government-sponsored accelerator. And as I said, kind of like the main goal really was to kind of like change the Chilean mentality. And I think to a large extent they did. But one of the challenges that we're facing was that, in some sense, what the accelerator was doing was helping create deal flow, as you were saying. So we're stimulating the creation of startups. And this was both for the participants of Startup Chile, but also because the program kind of like sparked other Chileans to start their own startups. It was kind of like a cultural revolution. But then the issue was that there weren't any investors. And that was a big issue at the time, right? It was, okay, should the government had also at the same time set up a VC fund that can absorb all these new deal flow that is being created by Startup Chile? Clearly at the time there was a big issue. And I think the answer is that not necessarily. So maybe they can, and if they have enough money, fantastic. But if not, I think that there's also something to be said about the environment itself trying to develop their own systems. And so what you can see in Chile is that with time, now you've had a lot of investment, or at least certainly more than before, investment in the country coming entirely from private parties. And so it's not only about the government setting up a fund just because they've set up a business accelerator and they basically fill every hole that is there. That's not their job, right? You want to incentivize things if there are frictions, but the government cannot do everything. And fundamentally, the problem in Chile was not, that VC investors were not coming necessarily because there wasn't any deal flow. That was part of the story. The story was more about pension funds not being able to invest, and that's an entirely different problem that VCs can face in different regions. So I don't think the answer is always yes, you have to do it. But yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we have another question that says, is the main constraint the startup or the growth of small firms that may not have collateral? In the UK, much of the effort was on the latter. The enterprise investment scheme supports tens of thousands of firms each year through tax relief. And the question is how to bring such schemes to Latin America realities and at a scale that is manageable for our governments. So what would you suggest to bring some of these schemes and initiatives to the Latin America reality?
So that was exactly what I was, oh, sorry, yeah. I'm gonna take this one. So that's exactly the scheme I was mentioning. So the enterprise investment scheme has been around for a number of years. Its more recent iteration, which is the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, the SACE, it was launched after the Great Recession. But the notion of providing incentives for individual investors to take equity positions in startups has been around in the UK for a long, long time. And yes, it's right, what is being said in the question, that up to this point, a number of companies have benefited from this. But at the very beginning, it was not like that. And so I would say that what would be a big obstacle to bring this to Colombia or to Latin America? One big issue would be that individual investors are going to have a hard time finding the startups from whom to buy equity. So that's exactly what happened in the UK. And so a big catalyst for these types of incentives to really work in that country, as I said, was kind of like the rise of the crowd equity funding platforms, where individual investors, not specialized, could actually log in, take a look at a number of startups that are looking for funds, and use the tax incentives to make those investments. If we don't have this kind of platforms where the costs of finding a potential startup are sufficiently low, even if you give very generous reliefs, you're not going to see investments where you want those investments to happen. In fact, what you're setting up is potential incentives for individuals to invest in their brother's company, in their pal's other company, and get and benefit from the relief of the government, right? So you could be setting up incentives that are quite distorted from, relative to what was the objective of the policymakers. So I think that thinking about how to set up the market for individual investors to really find those startups, and likewise for the startups to be able to find those individual investors, would be crucial in an environment like Latin America.
Professor Lerner?
I think that was a great answer. I can't really add much to it, so I think we'll let it stand.
Perfect. And Alessandro, you can confirm me, but if we have one more, it's why the focus on startups and not in overall small firms, especially again in developing countries?
Well, I mean, I guess my view is it's not an either or, right? That I think, my our colleague in the entrepreneurship group as a senior fellow, Karen Mills, who ran the Small Business Administration when she was under the Obama administration, always used to say there's really, two sets of programs within the SBA that are important, right? There's the, Small Business Administration, and then there's the Young Business Administration, right? And that in a way, certainly Main Street businesses can suffer. And in fact, as we know, many of them have suffered really grievously during the COVID crisis, and there's a need for support for them. But there is also a different set of issues, different set of financing needs for young businesses, and also potentially, a much bigger upside in terms of employment creation and so forth, and growth.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that. So I just want to point to a recent paper by Marcela Slava, a Colombian researcher, and John Haltivanger from Maryland. And one interesting thing that they do in their paper is that they compare the Colombian economy with the US economy. And they ask a very basic question. What explains this kind of like this differences in the growth of firms between the two countries? I mean, clearly in the US, they grow much more than in Colombia. And a very interesting finding is that they find that the median firm in the two countries is actually quite similar. It's not very different, which at the beginning, at least I found it very striking when I read that. And in fact, the difference between the growth rates in the life of a firm between the two countries is really explained by these young firms that are high growth, and in a very short period of time, they just completely detach themselves from the path of growth of the rest of the firms in the economy. So going back to Josh's point, it's not either or. I mean, clearly, both types of companies are potentially facing some frictions. And as policymakers, we may want to help them both. But why the focus on young firms, especially recently? Because we have growing evidence that it's those young firms that have incredible growth that are the ones that are determining the differences in the path in the growth between countries. And so if we want to make Colombia grow more, what do we need? We need more of those. And so we're looking for young, high growth firms that can dramatically change the landscape of a country. So I think that's why the focus, especially lately, on that.
Thank you very much, Professor Lerner and Professor Juanita for your time. I will give the floor to Alessandra.
Muchas gracias, Santiago, profesora González Uribe y profesor Lerner. A continuación, para seguir con la discusión, presento a Juan Hernández, quien es economista investigador en el Departamento de Investigación del BID. Juan tiene un doctorado en Economía en la Universidad de Pensilvania. Sus intereses de investigación se centran en los campos de finanzas internacionales, macroeconomía, fricciones financieras y problemas de selección adversa en tributación y contratos financieros. Adelante, Juan.
Gracias, Alessandra. Okay, I'm gonna continue in English. I'm gonna talk in this presentation and the next one about some tackles that we've been doing here at the ADB to kind of put a framework to all this knowledge out there, like kind of what Professor Lerner just talked about, Professor Gonzalez just talked about. And our goal here with this research agenda is to more or less have a theoretical framework to start thinking about what are the possible intended and unintended consequences of these open innovation initiatives. In particular, today we're going to talk about corporate venture capitalists, their advantages and their welfare effects. So again, since the open innovation paradigm came up, this is all been about knowledge flowing across firm borders. And again, the corporate ventures, they leverage on the knowledge that these corporations have to leverage innovative enterprises. By a paper by Professor Lerner, now 20 years ago, stated that these complementarities between the corporates and the startups that they were funding were critical for the success of these venture funds. And here the knowledge is something widely understood, not only as the know-how of the companies, they know how to better use capital, for example, as one of the knowledge that the corporations add value to the firm because they can tell where to invest, where to sell, which development path to take, basically like enhancing the productivity of such firms. Or also, we can talk about, about corporations knowing how to better assign capital. In this sense, is not that they really are increasing the true productivity of these startups above what they, but they just know which of these companies are better. And in this case, the CVC financing is not going to enhance productivity, but to signal higher productivity to the market. And there's also some evidence in the literature. Now, the question for us is, what are the welfare implications of those advantages? Why is it good or why is it bad? Why should we worry about including, bringing, or increasing the amount of corporate venture capital? So the answer, of course, is not going to be on those advantages alone. These advantages are going to interact with several features of the VC environment that we've just been discussing, like competition. There are a lot of financiers, VC, angels, mutual funds, a lot of agents in there. The limited liability clause, basically there's some contractual frictions that prevent from achieving the efficient outcome, like Juanito was mentioning. Adverse selection, the fact that we don't know and investors don't know which are the good or the bad quality startups, and they have to learn and that the entrepreneurs know better. Moral hazard thing, like we know uncontractable actions. Is the entrepreneur going to put enough effort? Is the venture capitalist going to put enough effort into the success of the company, or is going to let it die because it's not aligned with their incentives? And also externalities, spillovers. There's always complementary assets that corporation may hold, or the creative destruction of innovation that may hurt some agents inside the contractual relationship between venture capitalists or outside. So in a previous paper with my co-author, Daniel Wheels, we included features 1, 2, 3, basically limited liability, competition, and adverse selection. And we find what was like a unique VC equilibrium. And we found out that there was an extensive margin efficiency. Basically, too many projects are inactive. When there is too much competition, we're going to be funding a lot of socially inefficient projects. It's not just the fact that, again, for these venture companies, some projects are going to make a profit for the venture capitalists, some projects are going to make loss. Those will be private, and that's expected. But the fact that too many projects are going to be socially inefficient, it's going to mean that they're going to deviate resources from the economy, and that the expected surplus to be realized from those projects was below the opportunity cost of those resources diverted. This is going to leave room for potential welfare gains from interventions, and that's why we wanted to use this setup to begin with. Here, I'm going to abstract from moral hazard, which is another of the main reasons for corporates and main barriers, main frictions for corporate venturing. There is a paper by Hellman 22, which is a seminal paper here, and there is a very good paper that's going to be presented after me, also focusing on this. So, what is to add corporate venture capitalists to our environment? When we have selection advantage and a claim over private venture capital, we're going to put it some signal that the corporate venture capital see that split the markets. The other thing we want to talk is about the treatment advantage of the private venture capital. Basically, that the corporates truly increase productivity of entrepreneurship. Maybe not all of them. Maybe a corporation cannot increase the productivity of all the entrepreneurships, but some in their field or in their range of action. And as a preview of the results, well, we're still going to have that social inefficient projects are financed, which is okay. Adding CDCs with disadvantages is not going to fix all the inefficiencies even in this smaller setup, and our guess is that in a regional environment, this is not going to solve everything, but this is generally going to help. So in the selection case, when corporates only have a selection advantage, there are polar cases where the CDC inclusion could reduce welfare, particularly in environments where the high quality entrepreneurs are scarce. But in general, or numerical simulations trying to put numbers into the situation will lead that introducing the knowledge of the better selection capabilities of corporates is going to increase welfare. In the treatment case, it's a little bit more straightforward to get a positive welfare result, because it's easier to think that when you have an intervention that increases the productivity in the economy, yeah, you may exacerbate some frictions, but there is a direct effect on more output. Think about the selection case. The CVCs are actually not making anybody better. It's just probably helping the market to pick a little bit better the startups where to invest. So, well, in the interest of time, I want to skip this literature review and go straight with the framework. So, in the framework, our entrepreneurs are going to be endowed with an idea. Think of quality data. There's going to be a probability of success, which is data times f of k, where k is invested capital, and this function f is going to be just something relating the amount of investment towards the probability of success. You can see here that I'm going to abstract from all the moral hazard and all the staging investment that is also very common in the literature. We're going to talk from the very early investment to a success, and a successful venture is going to yield some output pi. And if it fails, it's going to yield 0. And I'm going to do that to make limited liability really binding. So in this environment, so all the technology, all the facing all the incentive provisions for moral hazard is going to be in reduced form embedded in that f of k. And I'm going to make entrepreneurs have no assets. They really need to borrow the capital they're going to use. I'm going to give them an outside option, W, which is just related to the wage in principle they could earn if they don't make a startup. But in the end, this is just the opportunity cost for the entrepreneurs and for the economy to, in addition to the resources scale of the time of the startup founder, basically. And we're going to have two types of lenders, corporations and privates, and I'm going to have plurality of them, that they're going to finance at the gross rate of. They are not going to be able to observe data, but they're going to know the distribution, and they're going to offer contract menus, which basically are going to specify an amount K of financing, a base transfer, and a successful bonus to the entrepreneur. In this simple environment, this is the most general contract that you could do. And well, you could think this of like a bank lending or a equity lending. It works the same for this simple environment. Once you generalize to multiple outcomes, then it goes, there are more nuances, but in the simple environment today, we're gonna stick to, it's immaterial if you call this equity or debt. We're gonna have limited liability, which implies the base transfer has to be positive, and also the base plus the bonus, the success bonus, meaning in case of failure, the corporation cannot extract anything from the entrepreneurs. This is not saying that there could be non-transferable benefits, like I was discussing, even if somebody starts a startup and fails, got network contacts, it got experience, probably would you have to compare with the same non-transferable, let's say, human capital accumulation or networking effects that person could have had while working in the private sector or working for somebody else. So in the end, we're gonna keep with the limited liability that implies that there's no transfer of monetary transfer from entrepreneurs to the venture capitals. And I try to put very little number of equations in this presentation, and I think these are gonna be all my equations. So if you bear with me, each project is gonna have like a gross expected surplus, which is basically just picking the right amount of capital as to maximize the expected profit minus the cost of that capital. This is like the full information surplus. And of course, it's gonna be a full information scale for this project, which is the one that maximizes the surplus. And what entrepreneurs are gonna do, well, they're gonna pick the best out of the available contracts, the one that maximize their expected utility, which is the base transfer plus the bonus in case of success. And the main insight for the Hernandez and Wills setup is that you can use the envelope condition in this equation to write this part, which is the limited liability restriction, like this, in terms of the derivative of the expected utility given to entrepreneurs. And all that this is saying is that limited liability is preventing the standard solution to the adverse selection problem, which is to make incentives very steep for entrepreneurs. You would think, I want all the good entrepreneurs, I don't want the bad, so I really want to give them a huge bonus to the good ones, so the bad ones are gonna say no, because I know I'm really likely to fail, so I'd rather stay out. What is the problem here is that when you want steep incentives, basically you give more to the good and you take more from the bad ones, but you have limited liability. You cannot take that much from the low quality entrepreneurs. So what do? You have to give more to everyone. And competition is going to drive this to the extreme. All venture capitalists are going to be pushing to give a better contract because they all want the few really great entrepreneurs. That means there are a lot of opportunities for low quality entrepreneurs to enter and gamble basically with the venture capitalist model. So this is where the inefficiency is going to come from. Even though all projects are going to be enacted at their efficient scale, we're going to have that financial intermediaries are going to make zero profit on aggregate. This is common on Bertrand competition thing about it. And limited liability is always going to bind because otherwise I could always cream scheme the market. If the other venture capitalist is not putting X equal to 0, making a 0 transfer, I can always see where he's not doing that. I can offer the same utility to that person, but with steeper incentives, which means I'm not going to have to deal with all the lower quality entrepreneurs. This is it graphically. This is the surplus curve. This straight line is going to be the utility curve that in this simple setup is going to be linear in the type. And this shaded area is going to represent the zero profit condition of the private venture capitalists. So here we're going to, this is profit, this other shaded area, I think doesn't look a different shade, but this is related to losses. And as you can see, there are some efficient projects. I have here W, which is the outside option. Only this fraction are the efficient projects where actually the surplus is greater than the opportunity cost. But the fact that these incentives cannot be as steep means that the lowest type entering is below this type here, which is the lowest efficient type. So there is some efficiency loss, which is this triangle below, just this triangle. All the losses are here are private transfers, and as welfare economists, we don't care about that. This is a welfare loss. So this is the setup where we begin. Now, what happens when you introduce selection advantage? Well, we try to do it in a simple way, but powerful sense. We're gonna see that there are some investors are gonna receive a signal, low or high, and conditional on receiving the signal, the distribution changes. The underlying distribution of entrepreneurs is such that if you got a high signal, the condition on having a high signal, the distribution dominates the distribution conditional on the low signal in the monotone likelihood ratio property sense. This is a very strong way of dominating. Is more than first order stochastic dominance. Is a standard in the other selection literature. But since one of our results is going to be that not necessarily even this very good signal is going to generate more welfare, we're happy to keep this assumption. We're going to have that private venture capitalists don't see the signals. So what's going to happen? The market is going to split in two. The corporate venture capitalists are going to be able to post two different contract menus in each market. The privates know because they don't see the signal, but they're going to know that they're going to face the low type. So the high signal startups are going to get financing only from corporations. And again, there will going to be zero profit by submarket, but intramarket cross subsidization. Let's see it graphically. Here on the left, we're going to have the high signals of market, and this is the contract offer, the higher line by the corporate venture capitalist. Of course, the guys with the high signal are going to be able to see the offerings by the private venture capitalists, but these are always going to be below. So then, in equilibrium, only these contracts are going to be taken that are coming from corporates. In the low signals of market, these guys are only going to see this low type of contract by private venture capitalists. And even corporates could enter this market and also offer the exact same contract that deals zero profit. And something important here, you see the areas are changing in size, but remember that you have to calculate profit, you'll have to integrate these areas, taking into account the density on each point. That's the signal is all about, shifting people, the amount of people, and the amount of startups at each quality. So yeah, you look here like you have a bigger inefficiency. Here the inefficiency looks smaller, but this is just forgetting about the density. So I just want to show a simple example. So think about the blue line representing the underlying distribution. This is kind of not a uniform, but a little bit skewed to the left, some scarcity of good ideas, some relative abundance of not so great ideas. And we want to put a signal that basically says if you get the low signal, you come from the red distribution. If I get the green signal, the high signal, you come from the green distribution. So actually getting a good signal suggests you're really good, but signal suggests you're most likely to be on this region. What happens numerically when I do that? Well, I'm gonna start talking from the efficient outcome. So this lowest efficient time is 0.62. If this were to be the case, there will be no inefficiency, and we normalize this surplus to 1, so 100% of the surplus. With only private venture capitalists, which I mean, what if we don't have the corporates, we just have private venture capitalists competing on this distribution, on the blue one? Well, we're gonna get an inefficiency of 9.1%. Why? Because the lowest type starting a project is gonna be of quality 0.52, way below. So the total surplus generating this economy is gonna be 90.9. Now, if I introduce the corporate venture equilibrium, I know I wanna have two markets. In the low signal market, the lowest type entering is 0.55. In the high signal, it's only 0.50. Here, the inefficiency is going to be in each of the markets relative to the total surplus, going to be 3.3%, 3.9% in the high signal market for a total inefficiency of 7.3. And the surplus is going to be mostly generated in the low signal, just because in this particular example, most people live here. 3/4 of the mass is here. And just 1/4 of the mass is on the high signal, but on relative terms, this is a little bit more than a third. The surplus in the high signal is a little bit more than 1/3 of the surplus in the low signal. So you get a total surplus of 92.7%, which is higher than what we had before, lower in efficiency. In general, this is what's going to happen when you put a signal. However, when we try from the theory to prove with these very particular strong type of signals to prove that no matter what, we were always going to get a welfare increase, which was our hypothesis and which is consistent with what other papers in the adverse selection and competition arena have found. We couldn't. And then looking into the mathematical proof, we realized we should be able to build a very special and skewed example where information and corporate presence actually reduce wealth. And this is what we have here. It's a little bit different parametrization than what we had before. The important part here, well, if you want to jump to the result, the inefficiency with the corporate is going to be 34% of the surplus. The inefficiency with only private venture capital is going to be 33.8%. Something that should be striking is the lowest type of entrepreneur that is taking the contract. The efficient outcome implies that everybody above 0.28 should be taken. With only private venture capital is 0.2792. And remember, this goes from 0 to 1. And when I have the corporate venture capitalists in these two submarkets, the thresholds are 0.279 and put 0.2797. What does that mean? is that there's very few people about the efficient outcomes. So they're actually, good entrepreneurs are very scarce in this economy, which means that if you go just a little bit below the efficient outcome, you're just generating enough losses for the private venture capitalists to offset all the expected profit that they got with all the rest of the people, all the mass above 0.28 up until 1. Again, this is not the general case, and for most reasonable parameterizations, this requires some tweaking, but I just want to leave there like, this is a very simple example, and this is not necessarily guaranteed to work. So we need to really know what we're doing. Taking stock, so from this very simple setup, we are finding that markets are going to react strongly to new pieces of information. And there are findings in the venture capital literature, like Bernstein and Cow, where they have actually went and talk and analyze venture capitalists and realize they're always seeking for small signals that can predict a little bit better the potential or the quality of startups, and that those small signals could have long-lasting consequences. So what we found in our simple setup is consistent with that. The introduction with CVC with selection advantage is generally welfare enhancing, and is gonna generally lower the weighted relative inefficiency. But again, it could be bad when the advantage is small and good projects are scarce. This can be easily generalizable to multiple signals, right? I only have a signal, good or bad, but I could have a credit score, and a credit score would be like 500 signals ranging from 350 to 850, and I'm gonna split the market in a lot, in 500 small sub-markets. But then welfare might decrease in the total number of signals, because you may think, so here, not only in that example, not only the good entrepreneurs were very scarce, but also the signal, the sense in which the distributions were different was very small. Still dominant, but but they were really close together. So again, if you go to a multiple number of signals, yeah, the first signal, if it separates a lot of the distributions, is of course gonna generate welfare. But once you start putting more and more signals, then the difference in a credit score of 700 and 701 is not that big to warrant an increase. And again, these monotone likelihood ratio property dominant signals are very strong. And there are signals that are weaker and may reduce welfare more. For example, a signal that separates the average entrepreneurs from all others. Because if I get a submarket with all good and all bad entrepreneurs, probably all my losses are gonna come from, not from private transfers, but from social losses. From all my losses are gonna come from the small triangle of inefficiency, basically. Now, the other thing we did is introduce corporate venture capital with complementarities, treatment effect. So how we do is we assume that there are synergies with corporations that increase their entrepreneurship productivity, maybe all of them or some, it will be a sub-market in that case. The new productivity for this treated is gonna be affected by this function theta times m, where m is a non-decreasing function, you like in Sig at all. And this implies that the treatment enhances more the good projects, as in the paper by Juanita and Santiago that was mentioned before. In this case, it's a little bit more straightforward. The CVC are gonna take all over the treated market. Why? Because they increase productivity, they can offer more, and they can just basically take all the market. And the private venture capitalists are going to, again, post one schedule tailored to the untreated. Basically, what we're thinking here is the corporation may not be able to increase the productivity of all the startups, but only the startups in this sector or in this particular subset for which they have extra knowledge. All projects are going to be enacted at their efficient scale. This is more important here because the efficient scale is going to change in competition, and the adverse selection may try to mark that, but it's not going to happen. And complementarities of this type will always increase welfare. This is even like, this is a weaker assumption, and we get a stronger result due to the direct surplus enhancing effect. What does that mean? That, well, if I increase your productivity and I can enact your new efficient scale, which means if productivity is higher, I'll also put more money into that, the total surplus grows way quicker than any distortions on the adverse selection effect. On the other hand, the treatment effect over private venture capital is still a very strong assumption. So, and on this empirical literature on treatment effect, there is always a problem underlying here, which is the adverse selection means there is a hidden quality on the startups that we don't see. So we only see who entered and the outcomes of the startups financed by a private venture capital or by a corporate venture capital. And then you try to decide which of that is selection or which of that is a true effect. But this hidden variable is obviously putting everything you try to infer through a huge problem from the homogeneity. And to add to the problem, for PVC, for private venture capital, is still a challenge to identify treatment effect, but some people have succeeded with smart econometric and experimental or quasi-experimental designs. But this challenge is compounded for corporate venture capitalists for two reasons. First, you need to have a treatment effect over the average treatment effect of the private venture capitalists. And second, some of the benefit may not be realized in the balance sheet of the startup. So again, there are synergies. These synergies may imply that some asset in the corporate balance sheet increases in valuation due to the success of the startup, and that's going to be very difficult to identify. So this is still a strong assumption, we think, but of course we need to learn more into this, and that's why we like to present first the selection effect, which in some sense is a weaker barrier for us. Can this be extended to include this can be extended to include externalities on corporations. We are working on that. It's like a preview of the results. So we were changing here the productivity, but we could as well change have changed the output, the price, or the value of a successful corporation or of a successful venture, yielding this to a corporation. So nothing happens. The key thing to include an externality would be to say that this extra profit or extra surplus is generated in the corporation independently of who is funding it. So if this is positive, I could say you generate more surplus or you're more likely to succeed. It's very similar in our analysis, and everything is going to run through. So if you assume that the corporations get this additional yield, they're going to take over the market on these startups that give them positive externalities. But there's going to be a public good under provision problem is because if we are 5 corporations and we all get the benefit, either we'll have to coordinate into a consortium, but then that's going to destroy competition. but somebody's going to have to provide the extra investment necessary to maximize the aggregate surplus, and that's not going to happen. This is a probably good problem standard in the externality literature, where that's what we're working at this point. And just to conclude, because I'm running short, I want to finish with a couple of questions, which is, okay, talk more about the role of externalities. Negative externalities are going to induce lower scale, which is a little bit weirder. We don't have that much on that yet. And the welfare effect with these externalities are also conditional on the nature of the effect on the balance sheets of corporations. Basically, if the startup is going to destroy some monopoly power, maybe it's not bad that happens, even though there is in principle an externality in the sense that this startup is successful, is going to destroy. Going forward, what we like to go is to see what happens when we introduce non-profit oriented intermediaries, like some of these accelerators or some government-sponsored fund that was going to target market share among finance. And this will force us to extend the analysis for potential disadvantages. Not only I make them more productive, I'm better at acceleration, but what if I'm not that good at selecting entrepreneurship? Can I still add value by just pushing more money? And finally, how does this thing interact with the moral hazard and fair governance? And with that question, I leave it to Alessandra. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Juan. Ahora voy a presentar a dos investigadores, al profesor Francesco Di Lorenzo, quien es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Estrategia e Innovación en Copenhagen Business School. El profesor Di Lorenzo tiene un doctorado en Ciencias de Administración de SADE Business School, estudia temas como la movilidad de trabajo entre organizaciones, el flujo de conocimiento, capital de riesgo corporativo, estrategias de innovación y desempeño de nuevas empresas e inversión de impacto. También está el profesor Thomas Rundt, quien es profesor del Departamento de Estrategia e Innovación de la Copenhagen Business School, tiene un doctorado en Economía de la Universidad Pompeu Fabra, ha publicado en varias revistas académicas como Journal of Industrial Economics y Journal of International Economics, entre otras. Sus intereses de investigación son la innovación, la economía organizacional y las políticas de competencia. Adelante, profesores. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, Alessandra, y a todo para incorporarse al evento. I'll continue in English. Thomas, thank you for sharing the slides. So Thomas and I, we're going to offer you today, actually in line with the initial discussion set up in the first part of the event, picking up on this corporate venture capital role in innovation in general, in open innovation policies, and of the startup success or failure. That's maybe what we're going to bring a little bit into the discussion. And also nicely to follow up just Juan, because our model will actually talk to an additional component that has not probably been so highlighted today. So it's nice to actually put our paper in all this conversation today. So thank you for the invitation. We're very happy to be here. Just to remind that this is a project that has been also partially funded by the Competitiveness Technology Innovation Department at the EADB. And so we're happy actually to share with the IDB crowd and stakeholders what we have found. Thomas, can you move to the next slide? I think can you go full screen, Thomas? Because yeah, thank you. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so let me introduce you just the two concepts we're going to bring together. So the first concept is the open innovation, as you know, of course, discussed extensively today. So this idea basically that firms can in fact look at the innovation strategy not anymore internally but also externally, and in fact the idea of open innovation is not necessarily conflictive between internal activities and external activities, but rather integrating the two of them research has been focusing primarily on the idea of inbound versus outbound innovation, or actually the return in terms of pecuniary and non-pecuniary returns about open innovation activities. In fact, the process is basically the idea of kind of obtaining some innovation, then integrating the firm strategy, basically in the R&D or other functions within the firm, and then basically translate as a value proposition for the market, right? So in fact, the open innovation, it does imply opening the banners of the firm, interacting with the stellar actors of a different source, a different type, in order to bring into the firm some new solutions to then transform those solutions in commercialization opportunity that increase the value to our customer. At the same time, those solutions can also be developed with actors which are outside the firms, right? So this idea of boundary spanning that firms can manage in their innovation activities has in fact given the name of open in that sense. So basically breaking the boundaries of a firm and finding different solutions inside and outside and interacting these two aspects. Who are basically the actor in this sense? Well, we can think about the typical kind of crowdsourcing that has been also mentioned today, or kind of interorganizational alliances or strategic partnerships done by firms, or in license agreements. So basically collaborating with other actors in the industry or across different industry to leverage assets that maybe internally might not be as important, and therefore other players throughout royalties agreement actually can exploit, or licensing in. Basically actually taking the right of using the technology into the boundaries of the firm to leverage it again to create value proposition. In that sense, the open innovation literature open also to some frictions that happen at the firm level, and some of this has been actually creating some dilemmas of open innovation. So the idea is, for example, questions such as what is the optimal level of openness that a firm should consider when actually opening the boundaries of the firm to collaborate for innovation projects, or for example, the non-invented ear syndrome. So the idea that when certain innovation are brought from outside to inside through collaboration, for example, licensing in, that might create some resistance, some friction into the organization, for example, due to either certain units that are not willing to absorb the brought in innovation through some incentives that might diverge from the idea of adopting that innovation that the firm has brought into the boundaries of the firm, or actually also looking at how the individuals might be in somehow dependent on what they know, and therefore promoting first what they've been knowing and creating within the firm, and therefore in somehow creating a suboptimal use of the innovation that has been brought through open innovation program, therefore opening the question of is actually efficient at all, right? But beyond that, the literature is actually proposing, of course, a positive effect and also more negative effect of the open innovation. Thomas, can you change the slide? One specific, thank you. One specific actor that we have been focusing on is corporations. So as we already discussed before, a way in which corporation can in fact think about how to open their boundaries and access innovation that resides out of the firms is setting up funds and so-called corporate venture capital funds. So these are basically units, right, that are dedicated to invest in privately held entrepreneurial ventures. The idea that these funds can be, as we discussed today, can be external or internal. So some of them that actually are simply a division within the firm. In some other cases, actually independent legal unit. So reporting to different functions, usually very top into the organization, if not directly to the CEO, most of the time close to the business development division. Example, Intel Capital Corp, Google Ventures, Dell Technology Capital, Novartis Venture, and so on and so forth, right? Most of these investments primarily are done in the ICT and life science. If you sum up actually in the last 30 years, the number of investments done, or the industry in which the startup receiving those CVC money are active, ICT, sorry, so information technology and life science, or biotech, pharma, and medical devices, sum up to 80+% of the total amount of money invested, with ICT primarily leading with a 60+ and pharma with a 20+. So that's primarily the distributions. Importantly, corporate venture capital is the second investor in terms of ranking, in terms of importance of investment. VC, of course, takes the lead. And as you can see on the right, there is, in fact, the trends of investing in the last 30 years, but this is a graph that we have been all seeing today. Now, what is a stressing point of the paper is looking not necessarily on the positive effects, which has been argued to be there in many ways, also by Juan. So of course, we know from the literature that corporate investors increase financial return for the startup when they go in an IPO situation or in an acquisition value. Okay, so they get acquired. Increase also the scientific performance and innovation performance through patents, trademark, scientific publication of the startup that actually they backed. Okay, but as well as they get return, right? So they also increase kind of Tobin's Q value, or in general value of the firms that invest heavily in startup through the corporate venture capital fund, as well as increase innovation. So it seems that actually CVC is a fairly a nice fairy tale positive, right? For the startup receiving the money, for the company doing the investment. Now, we actually want to bring to the picture also the concept of misappropriation. In fact, there is some literature that talk about the problem that are created, so the frictions that are created between the corporate investors and the startup when it comes to misappropriation of knowledge assets. In that sense, some previous literature talk about the paradox of corporate venture capital in an action, or some others talk about swimming with sharks. So what these ideas are about is basically saying, hey, you know, a corporate investor does put the money on the table, so invest in a startup, but it doesn't come for free. Of course, it comes for learning, okay? But that learning at some point can come to the point of creating the possibility of stealing an idea. In fact, coming back also to some intuition of the Juan model, the corporation can be threatened by the emergence of a startup that might disrupt basically the modeling industry and appropriate profits into the industry, up to the point that the corporation might potentially use the CVC channel to enter and in fact appropriate, in this sense misappropriate, so stealing ideas from the venture in order to turn this out. In this case, I want to give you just an intuition of an example. There's a company called Tyson Food that has been investing in another company, a small startup called, by then small, called Beyond Meats. Tyson Food is absolutely specialized in meat production, while Beyond Meat was actually a new vegan player into the industry, creating this alternative, fairly successful. So it turns out that Tyson Food entered as an investor approximately as a 6, 7, 8%. Of the equity of Beyond Meat, and what happened is that just right before Beyond Meat was actually going up for an IPO, Tyson Food exited investment and opened up his own division for vegan meat production. So in that sense, I mean, Beyond Meat is still on the market, experienced a lot of turbulences in the IPO phase and also post-IPO, precisely because of the signal that has been sent to the market, but also for the direct competition that Tyson Food created through the, in somehow, we can talk in a way about misappropriation of the idea, so learning to then exploit and compete, right? So I'm gonna now let, therefore, Thomas introduce into a model in which we kind of somehow explore this friction and tensions ideas that are emerging, in fact, beyond the benefit, right, between the corporate investors and the startups.
Okay, and thank you also from my side for organizing this very nice event. And also to Juan for actually introducing very nicely what this paper does and what it doesn't do. So what we want to do is to provide a very simple model that combines the literature on corporate venture capital with the one on open innovation. So we have an entrepreneur that needs funding for a project, and then we have an investor that might provide valuable assistance, such as advice or resources to labs or to specialists working in the investor's firms or things like that. Now, the problem becomes that to sort of give you the basic idea is that those investors that can potentially contribute the most to the development of the venture are also those that will have the strongest incentive to misappropriate or to steal the idea of the entrepreneur. And from point of view of the entrepreneur, that to avoid that problem, what they need to do is that you actually need to give these investors quite a large equity stake to avoid this happening. And that will be the reason why you might want to avoid them. Now, if protection is weak, the less capable investor is less. I mean, you don't necessarily choose the most capable investor, the one that could actually increase the value the most. And that is exactly sort of the paradox of the corporate venture capital. So you do not necessarily choose the most capable investor, because in that case you really have fear of misappropriation. And to give you some of the results up front, we find that this paradox, it's more likely to arise when the upfront investment is modest of the investors. You don't necessarily need a lot of cash to make this going. Not so surprisingly, when the protection of the idea is weak, for instance, maybe because intellectual properties are weak in that particular industry. But also when the investor private benefits from the investment, which could be, as Juanita was talking about, it could be scouting benefits, it could be knowledge spillovers, when these benefits are relatively modest. So these are the situations where you might not necessarily choose the most capable investor. So the model, as I said, is fairly simple. So we have an entrepreneur with an idea, but insufficient capital. So the entrepreneur needs capital F, some amount of money, to continue the development. So the investor may help to develop the idea. We've talked a lot about today what this could be: assistance, access to staff, connections to suppliers, things like that. And in the same way, venture capitalists will often specialize in industry and be able to help them grow their business, attract the right talent, and other benefits. So there will be very few formulas, but there will be a little bit of notation. So the value of an innovation will depend on the efforts invested by the entrepreneur and of the investor. So the value will be E, small e, which will be the effort of the entrepreneur, and beta, that will be sort of a match-specific capability of the investor, and capital E, that will be the effort of the investor, right? So the more both parties invest, the more value will be created, the more valuable will the venture be. And we assume that these efforts come at quadratic cost. Now, we also make the assumption that it's the effort of the entrepreneur that's central. So that's why this beta is smaller than 1. So the effort of the investor creates less value, everything equal, than the one of the entrepreneur. It's really the entrepreneur who's the central player here for the value creation. We will assume that efforts are non-contractable. So that's, of course, that's the extreme assumption, right? But the idea is that things like helpfulness or willing to prioritize the entrepreneur when it's really needed are things that are hard to specify in a contract, right? So there will be other things that you can specify in a contract, but the assumption is really there are also things that are difficult to specify in a contract. The investor receives some private benefits, which is theta times the value created or the value of the venture. And those could be, as I was talking about, scouting benefits, technology spillovers, things like that, right? So we could, for instance, think of a high theta as a corporate investor in a related industry that actually benefits a lot from working with the startup, or if fees are low, it could be a corporate investor in a non-related industry, perhaps, that would benefit less from this cooperation. So we'll assume that a contract here, that's an equity share S in return for the needed capital. And we follow the paper that Juan also mentioned by Hellman, in assuming that there cannot be any upfront payments due to, well, Hellman used the word imposters, right? So if you would give large upfront payments, well, you would have lots of entrepreneurs coming to you, also those that had ideas that they actually know would not be realizable, so would never make money. So to avoid that, you don't make upfront payments. All right, and now comes then the crucial part, as Francesco was mentioning. There is the risk of misappropriation by the investor. So the investor may actually steal the idea and develop it, in which case the investor's payoff will depend on his own efforts only, because, well, the entrepreneur is not there any longer. And then a parameter alpha, which is the protection that this idea has, right? So it could be both formal IP, intellectual property protection, so patenting, maybe the strength of patents, but it could also be simply how crucial is the entrepreneur for this project, right? So we would think of low alpha as strong protection, because the investor doesn't get a lot out of stealing the idea, whereas high alpha, that would be a situation of weak protection. We will also assume that if the idea is stolen, well, the entrepreneur will not try to develop it any longer. They lost the head start. They need to raise capital again, so they simply leave and do something else. There will be a pool of investors that will be characterized by different alpha, beta, and thetas, that is, by different capabilities, how much they can contribute, by differences in theta, the private benefits they enjoy, and then also, and that's perhaps less investor specific, that's the protection alpha. And as also Juan was assuming, we have a competitive capital market with zero expected return. So what's the timing? Well, the entrepreneur and the investor match and contract. Then afterwards, the investor decides whether to steal the idea or not. Then the efforts are chosen simultaneously, and finally payoffs are realized. All right, so as a benchmark, we will look at a situation where there's no risk of misappropriation. So in that situation, the investor will invest in the startup, will invest the amount of money F, and will receive a total return of F, but that will include both the pecuniary and the non-pecuniary returns. That is both the money that comes from the equity stake, but also the learning benefits. So the equity stake that the investor must be given will be decreasing in the private benefits, because they get a different type of return in that situation when there are lots of private benefits. So you need to give them lower equity stake. And it will also be decreasing in the capability of the investor. So if it's a more capable investor, the venture will generate more value, and you need to give them a lower stake in that to repay their upfront investment. So what happens in this situation is that an entrepreneur prefers the most capable investor it can find, and also one that enjoy high private benefits from the investment. So that could, as I was mentioning before, for instance, be a corporate investor in a related industry. Now, in this model, right, the players, they are rational, right? So the entrepreneur is rational. So the rational will not, the rational entrepreneur will not enter into a contract with an investor that would afterwards steal the idea. So misappropriation turns out to be a concern if the investor has a low equity stake. So it actually does not get so much out of the project if it stays in there, but is very able to develop it on its own. So it gets little from being there, but it gets a lot from stealing the idea. That creates the risk of misappropriation. And in that sense, what becomes the solution is to increase the equity stake beyond what's necessary to repay the investment F. So you give them a high equity stake in order to make sure that they have more, or they gain more from staying and developing the venture than they do from stealing the idea. The equity stakes that prevents stealing or misappropriation, that's is increasing in alpha. That is, as protection becomes more of a concern. That was a small typo there. It is increasing in the capability of the investor beta, as a more able investor also benefits more from stealing the idea. It is better able to develop it on its own. And finally, and I think that's probably one of the new things that this model brings out, is that it's actually the equity stake is decreasing in the private benefits. So the more private benefits the investor gets from being involved in this project, the less or the lower are their incentives to steal the idea. The intuition is here that, well, they create more value by staying together, working together, contributing, both of them, the entrepreneur as well as the investor. And for that reason, well, there would also be more private benefits generated if they work together. And the more private benefit, or the more important these private benefits are, the less the incentive to steal and break that sort of fruitful cooperation. If we can draw it as well, so we have here on the x-axis, we have the capability of the entrepreneur. And for low levels of capabilities, there's no issue of misappropriation. So in fact, you can see the red line, that's the equity stake you need when there's no risk of misappropriation, and that's decreasing in beta, the capability of the investor. But then at some point at what we call beta lower bar, misappropriation becomes a concern, and afterwards you see that that's the blue dotted line. The more capable the investor is, the higher equity stake they need to be given to avoid them stealing the idea. The choice of investor, well, that depends on the protection of the idea. If there is strong protection of the idea, you simply choose the most capable investor around, preferably one with beta equal to 1. If there's weak protection, well, then you want to choose the most capable investor that doesn't have an incentive to steal your idea, right? So that is the one where you can let them, you just give them enough equity to repay their investment, and at that, but yeah, but you don't want anybody more capable than that, because in that case they would need to have a higher equity stake. For intermediate levels of protection, you either choose the most capable investor that wouldn't have an incentive to steal your idea, or you choose the most capable one. And as I was mentioning before, these private benefits, they create value and dampens the incentive to misappropriate. So in the interest of time, I might actually skip the next figure here and go to the empirical predictions. So the paradox of corporate venture capital, whereby an entrepreneur does not choose the corporate investor most able to contribute to the success, well, that is more likely to happen in situations where the underlying invention is weakly protected, where the corporate investor does not enjoy significant private benefits from learning or scouting, and where the upfront monetary investment is moderate. We were also looking at the welfare effects, which we here define as the sum of the payoff of the entrepreneur and the investor. And what comes out pretty clearly is that, well, the entrepreneur has too strong an incentive from point of view of welfare not to choose the most capable investor. Why is that? Well, that's kind of intuitive, because giving a high equity stake to the investor, that's a loss from the entrepreneur, but that is not to the same extent a loss to society. I should say that here, giving a high equity stake, it's not just redistribution, because it does affect incentives, but the argument still applies, right? So giving a high equity stake is a loss for the entrepreneur. It's money lost, but it's not to the same extent a loss for society, as it's just money that the investor then gets. Okay, so policy implications. Well, I think you always have to be a little bit careful with taking these simple models and then make strong policy implications, but let me have a go at that. So the market for corporate venture capital, I think it works better when intellectual property rights are strong. That's a fairly general result, which you see also in the literature on markets for technology. So that's not very surprising. Well, here, stretching the logic of the model a little bit, what I think the model shows is that if you have a corporate investor, then a significant equity stake can actually have beneficial effects, both for the investment of the corporate investor. If they have more skin in the game, they'll invest more in helping the venture, but then also in avoiding misappropriation. So you could perhaps think of making sort of governments, when you, for instance, do matching funding to startups, that you make it conditional on the level. If there is a corporate investor involved, you make it conditional on sufficient level of engagement by the corporate investor to sort of get this positive effect of that comes about when the corporation has a significant equity stake. We could also think about going back to some of the things that Juanita was talking about, that making sure that entrepreneurs have access to help and complementary assets. Well, that's of course very useful, but perhaps they can in certain situations be better provided by incubators or business accelerators that actually do not have the same misappropriation incentive. And I think that's that.
Muchas gracias a ambos por la excelente presentación. Ahora, para terminar el día de hoy, le voy a dar la palabra a Edwin Goñi, quien es economista líder de la División de Competitividad e Innovación, para las palabras de cierre del día 1.
Thank you, Alessandra. Can you hear me?
Sí.
Okay. So what a great day to close what a great way to close a day full of knowledge sharing. Thanks very much, Francesco and Thomas. Thomas, nice to make your acquaintance. On behalf of the organizers and the bank, I want to thank again to all of our presenters and moderators today for such a motivating session. So to wrap up, the takeaways: why is collaboration to generate innovations valuable? So from the presentations, we can learn that reliable screening and selection of investable projects that may be more likely to succeed is of value. The 3 first papers actually stress the value of selection and the impact on the success of CVC and accelerator programs in their studies. Another reason is because smart capital and dedicated services secured by the corporations that engage into these type of arrangements has also a value. It's not just about money, right? It's also about specific customized services and dedicated and specialized interactions and knowledge shared by the corporations with the startups that justify this kind of collaborative arrangements. So, but is the grass always bringing these collaborations? This last paper by Francesco and Thomas actually has shown us that there are risks of misappropriations. So not everything is good. So what is the space for public intervention? To begin with, every one of the participants has stressed that the public intervention should be not substitutory of the private efforts. It should be complementary. So what is that space for public intervention? In the upsides, first, promote highly effective and efficient screening and selection. but also promote the increase of the density of the donor pool of investable projects. This means strengthen the deal flow. In the second hand, promote the access to smart, customized services that complement the liquidity needs. This means that we should think not only into how securing access to financial resources, but also to secure the soft treats that go along the implementation and execution of these types of programs. And in the downsides, so the public policy should also be aware of these misappropriation effects, and regulation should try to play a role in there. So that's all for today. We hope that you can join us tomorrow as well, when we are going to have conversations with representatives of corporations conducting open innovation emblematic initiatives in the region to learn from firsthand from their initiatives, learnings, and challenges when designing and implementing these initiatives in the region. So we hope to see you all tomorrow, and thanks again to all for your attendance and your great questions. Thanks again for a great day of learning and knowledge sharing.
Muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia. Los esperamos mañana en el mismo link.